Good morning, all. I'm just kind of looking at my screen here, checking on quorum, which I think we have now. I know one counselor mentioned they would be tardy this morning, which is fine. So since it's 9:35, I will commence our meeting of the Standing Committee on Environmental Protection, Water and Waste Management for Tuesday, June 21st. Welcome to Agenda 25. So to begin, I will ask for just a quick roll call from Christopher.
Just bear with me for one moment, Chair.
No problem. Riley's been throwing me for a loop in the last few days with this whole different camera angle in his office. I'm like, it's so, I don't know. I'm just not used to it. It's like I used to, I did like 6 months in my camper. It got so bad that everyone just assumed I was actually living in it, which is strange because it was parked next to my house, which was filled with, the 1,000 kids that I have. Try chairing a committee with 1,000 kids. Doesn't work.
You have to say in a van down by the river.
Okay, I can do it, but I won't.
If you're ready for the roll, Chair, I can do that now.
Yes.
Councillor Brockington,
Here.
Councillor Cloutier,
Present.
Councillor Darouz,
Yeah.
Councillor Eglai. Oh, Councillor Eglai.
He's the one that said he'd be a bit late.
Okay, Councillor Hubley.
Here.
Councillor King.
Here.
Councillor McKinney.
Here.
Vice Chairman Ard.
Good morning.
You have quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I even have the hair from Matt Foley at this point. If I did I could pull it up and it'd be like about 6 inches tall. But I digress. We're not here for my Saturday Night Live reenactments from the early 90s. In grade 7, I actually did a speech on the whole speech was Saturday Night Live. I just did SNL impressions, Dana Carvey doing George Bush, all these things. I'm really getting off track. I got to stop doing that. I'll be better.
Were you thinking of hosting or chairing an environment committee meeting today, Scott? Or
Yeah. No, I promise I'll be better.
Curious.
I'll be better next term. I'll be more organized next term. Okay, declarations of interest. Seeing none? You don't even know what you're interested in at this point. Like, what's he sharing today? Confirmation minutes for the meeting of Tuesday, May 17th, 2022. Are those minutes confirmed?
Confirmed.
Yep.
Thank you so much. So first thing first, we have a deferral of the anti-idling bylaw inquiry, which came from last meeting. We have some speakers on that, so we'll come back to that. Climate change master plan, climate vulnerability and risk assessment, which is item number 1. Presentation and speakers on that one. Come back to that. Item number 2 is 2021 Hydro-Waterway dividend surplus spending plan. Also speakers and a presentation. Item number 3 is an update on the transition to provincial blue box individual producer responsibility. Don't have any speakers on it. I'm not sure how everyone feels about that. I know it was circulated. It's just an update on where we stand right now with the blue box transition with the province. Of course, it's individual producer responsibility. The province is transitioning the entire province to this over the few years. Ottawa is one of the first to start, which will be July 1st, 2023. So there is some contractual elements to this as well. So I'm not sure if anyone needed to hold this item or if we could go ahead, Councillor King.
I don't think we need to hold. I did have just a real brief question to staff around communications. Now, I know we're dealing with the financial components and the negotiations, but obviously there would be implications once this comes into effect, especially since it will be the producers dealing with the challenges. So, I just wanted a quick question to staff about what our thinking is as a city concerning communicating these changes and service inquiries around that from residents who will be subjected to this new system.
Yeah, we have Andrea Gayfari here. I mean, ultimately, I mean, Andrea can respond. I mean, we don't fully know the exact impacts just yet. They could be minimal to non-existent if we carry on with the collection as we've been doing with contractors and whatnot, but we don't know that entirely. But Andrea can maybe touch on that a bit more if I've said anything wrong.
No, Chair, you said it perfectly. We'll evaluate as we go along and make sure to keep communicating with our residents. We have our own goals and diversion programs, and we will make sure to continue to keep communicating those.
I appreciate that. I know in the report, it was clear that we don't get as many inquiries, or when we do, they're effectively responded to. Obviously, we want to ensure that that level of responsiveness is maintained, regardless of who's in charge of the system per se. Because as we know, residents, despite the implementation of this system, or I should say the imposition of the system, at the end of the day, they just see one city, and we'll be calling our offices when there are challenges. So we just want to make sure there's going to be a proper communication strategy that's put in place to deal with this. So I appreciate the answer based on the amount of information we have at hand, and I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, obviously the goal of IPR is to reduce the amount of plastics that exist out there by making the producers responsible for its collection and its processing. But at the same time, I can tell you that our staff have been focused on ensuring that the impact to the resident is as minimal as possible, ideally non-existent, and that residents keep on doing what they've been doing for years, putting their items at the end of the laneway to be collected. Okay, so the report in front of us is that the State Committee on Environment, Professional Water and Waste Management recommend that Council, 1, receive an update on the provincial Blue Box program transition to individual producer responsibility, and 2, delegate the authority of General Manager of Public Works Department in consultation with legal, finance, and supply services to negotiate using the proposed guidelines and execute in the best interest of the city the agreements needed for transition period of the provincial IPR Blue Box program, July 1st, 2023 to December 31st, 2025, as described within this report, and accompanying confidential memorandum financial implications for said report, a memo to be issued separately, which it was. On that item?
Carried.
Thank you. So item 4 is the Ruisseau Park Ravine Rehabilitation Class Environmental Assessment and Functional Design in Councillor Judas's Innis ward. So we don't have any speakers. I don't think there's need for presentation on this. So on the item is that the Standing Committee on Environment, Professional Water and Waste Management recommend, that's funny, the word committee is in the recommendation twice, recommend Council approve the results of the class environmental assessment study for the Ruisseau Park Ravine Rehabilitation as detailed in document 1, and direct staff to proceed with posting the notice of study completion for a 30-day public review period in accordance with the Ontario Municipal Class Environmental Assessment Schedule B process. Is that item carried?
Carried.
Thank you. Item 5 is a drinking water quality management system 2021 management review report, that our committee received the 2021 management review report. That item received?
Received.
Thank you. And we have 2 councillors' items, one from Councillor McKenney on the endorsement of the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and item 7 is from Councillor Menard on the tree protection bylaw. So that those 2 items both have speakers, so we'll come back to those, and then we have we'll get to that later. Okay, so we'll go back to ostensibly item 0, which was the response to inquiry on effectiveness and enforceability of anti-idling bylaw. So I will, it was Councillor Menard that asked for it to be brought to this committee for the meeting. So I'll ask Councillor Menard just to speak briefly on it. I don't believe I have staff here to do any presentation on on the response at all. I mean, we've all had the response for quite some time. And then we have a couple delegations on the matter.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just very, very briefly, I was really pleased that staff got back to us on this issue. They summarized some of the difficulty, I think, in enforcing this bylaw, or what we've seen enforced in the last several years in Ottawa. I think there were 10 tickets issued on idling in the last several years, so not many. We are seeing this behavior outside of our schools and in areas where it affects our air quality. And so I wanted to make sure to get it on the agenda this term of council. I know that there's some delegations that'll speak to this. The community's been doing some good work on it with some analysis in other municipalities. So I'm looking forward to hearing from them. And the one thing I'll just mention is we do have a motion drafted, and I'm not sure, Chris, if you had circulated that. Staff have helped us draft a motion with regard to the bylaw update. And there it is. So Chair, you okay if I just read this out before delegations start?
Yeah, ideally, go ahead.
Okay, so whereas Council declared a climate emergency, April 24th, 2019, whereas the link between greenhouse gas emissions, including those from vehicles and climate change and heat island effects, is well researched and evident. And whereas Environment Canada estimates air pollution from vehicle emissions contribute to 15,000 premature deaths each year in Canada through emission exhaust comprised of nitrogen oxides, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxides, volatile organic compounds, and fine particulate matter, which can irritate the nose and throat and cause long-term damage like asthma, decreased lung function, cardiac disease, and cancer. And whereas idling in areas such as school zones, bus stops, and community centers places vulnerable populations at risk from air pollution, whereas the intent of Ottawa's current anti-idling bylaw was to provide education and warnings and enforce for repeat offenders, and whereas the idling control bylaw is rarely enforced, written with many exemptions and out of date in comparison to other mid-sized cities, and whereas Ottawa experienced a 3-week-long occupation in winter 2022, which resulted in residents walking through and breathing in vehicle exhaust fumes at a level significantly higher than the average for Ottawa, with more Freedom Convoy related protests expect to continue through the summer. And whereas in February 2022, emergency measures were enacted that gave bylaw and regulatory services the authority to enforce no idling rules at -15 and above in the occupied zone of the city for the duration of the emergency period, and or to sunset at 2 months, and raise the fine for idling from $100 to $1,000 for the same time period. And whereas the bylaw framework specified that the city's bylaw should be reviewed and updated every 10 years, and the anti-idling bylaw was last updated 15 years ago in 2007. And whereas in accordance with the council approved bylaw review framework, it is anticipated that the 2023 to 2026 bylaw review work plan will be brought forward for council's consideration and approval early in the new term of council to identify bylaw reviews to be undertaken during the term. Therefore, be it resolved that the Standing Committee on Environmental Protection, Water and Waste Management recommend council direct public policy development services and emergency and protective services to include a comprehensive bylaw review of bylaw number 2007-266 for council consideration as part of the 2023 to 2026 bylaw review work plan to be approved by council in 2023, and that this review shall include consideration of the following components: temperature thresholds, considering the increasing heat waves due to climate change as per the National Capital Climate Projections and our climate resiliency strategy in a comparison to other major Canadian cities, fines and time thresholds in relation to other major Canadian cities, exemptions, which currently include 12 categories of vehicles that are not subject to the bylaw, improved definitions of terms such as idle, mobile workshop, normal farm practice, private transit vehicle, and vehicle to ensure accuracy and enforceability, enforcement, providing clarity on how citizens can report non-compliant idling to the city for investigation and a review of complaints, associated actions, and effectiveness, integration and updating of the vehicle and equipment idling policy dated June 2002, number FS01, updated February 2021. And therefore be it resolved that council requests the Ottawa Board of Health consider developing a public education and signage campaign to reduce unnecessary idling in collaboration with the City of Ottawa staff, including public information and media relations and emergency and protective services. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I know in normal farm practice, we use a definition provided from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs that I think we embedded that in our site alteration bylaw when we developed that a few years ago, back in my AIR days. Okay, so let's go to our delegate. Hey, look at that. It's like the timer. I don't know if everyone can see the timer screen, probably not everyone watching from home, but it's like old school CTV when it's like 2 or 3 in the morning and it plays the national anthem and then boom, it goes to the color coded bars. Memories. Okay, our first speaker is Joan Freeman.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Joan.
This is auspicious. I think this may be your last committee meeting, so congratulations to Chair Moffat and others. Okay, I'm speaking. I just want to thank Councillor Menard for the motion, and I'm speaking today on behalf of cafes as well as a community association working group, and we are very pleased and support the motion that he's just read out. I like to point out that I'm actually representing a lot of people behind me. Cafes has 50 community associations, and there's also this working group that started independently of cafes. 4 community associations have been active in it. Centertown taking the lead, Hintonburg, Vanier, and Glebe. And there's also been observation and interest from 2 or 3 other community associations. And this is such a burning issue that I've been even getting emails about this presentation from people on holidays, which is quite surprising to me. I did send a document to be uploaded. I don't know, Chris, if you got it there. Great, thanks. So this picture is interesting. Although idling really only came to the mind of some of us during the convoy, it's been on the mind of a lot of people for quite a bit longer. This is a picture from a student competition that was run on the health benefits of not idling around schools. This is in 2002, and in fact, the first motion in a community association was done by a transportation committee, not environment. So there's a lot of interest in this subject, even though it's a bit of a sleeper. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the idling really came to the forefront during the convoy and the occupation this past winter, where we had 3 weeks of air pollution and severe health and air quality problems. Next slide, please. As the motion has just said, the current bylaw mostly focuses on education and doesn't enforce much, or it's frankly not known about much. Yet still, there's been over 4,000 complaints about idling since the bylaw came into force. And these complaints, interestingly, in the suburbs originally mostly around schools and idling around schools. In the downtown, there's more a mixture around schools, seniors, residents, delivery trucks, and municipal vehicles. Next slide, please. As we all became aware, there are definitely serious health and air quality problems related to idling. I didn't know this until recently, that 1 in 6 deaths globally are related to air pollution. That's huge. And during the convoy, I think we had issues with asthma and lots of respiratory problems. I personally, some of the people on the climate on this working group committee had asthma problems. Next slide, please. There are also environmental impacts. Idling causes hot spots of air pollution, especially where there's congestion. In hot summer days, idling intensifies the air pollution problems, and it also increases the heat island effect, just what we don't want. It also contributes significantly to greenhouse gases, so reducing it would help Ottawa meet its targets. Next slide, please. There are significant costs to idling, and there are benefits from preventing it. And these benefits go to both the city and to private vehicle owners. Today, I want to talk about the benefits for the city. I recently realized that Edmonton made idling a zero tolerance issue, and for its municipal vehicles, this was actually several years ago before gas prices were so high. And even then, by doing so, they saved millions and millions of dollars. Gas prices are now $2 a liter. So Ottawa could do the same thing and save quite a bit of money. I don't know the exact amount, but a 2008 study in Ontario, including Ottawa, found that 30 to 50% of the time municipal vehicles are running, they are idling.
1 minute.
I think that's probably decreased, but even if it was only 20%, it would save us lots of money. Next slide. Our working group would like to have these emergency measures brought into place, not next year, but this year, and to continue with the emergency measures that reinstated with the convoy for the reasons that we are all becoming aware of. I think there's also win-win-win solutions for councillors for going ahead with this. Next slide, please. And I would hope that the councillors will see the wisdom in invoking some changes, as the kids have, and seeing the importance of doing this soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan. Don't get too ahead of yourself. This isn't our last meeting. We still have work to do. We have a meeting scheduled in September. We aren't like our federal and provincial counterparts where we just F off once the writs dropped and we don't actually do any work whatsoever while we're campaigning. We actually all have jobs still to do between now and November 14th. I might even just hold a special meeting of all committees I chair on November 14th, just for fun, just to hold on to power, just for that one little grasping moment. Councillor Menard has a question for you, Joan.
And what you don't know about that, Joan, is it's actually half the committees that we have that Scott chairs, which is an all-time record. So, Joan, I just wanted to say thank you for all the work you've done on this. You've been a big proponent of this, and you've pushed this along. I guess in your research of other municipalities, and I see Paulina's up next as well, but in your research of other municipalities, who does it really well? I mean, who should we be emulating here in Ottawa?
Great question. I'm going to let Paulina add more to this because she's done more delving on this. But I would say we do need to look at places like Edmonton where they don't have temperature thresholds, which, you know, when it's pretty darn cold in Edmonton. So the fact that our temperature thresholds mean that the convoy in the winter wasn't going to be covered for idling, and in the summertime, any future convoys won't be covered either, which is also, you know, to have a bylaw that covers less than half of our year is not very good. So that's one point. I think we actually need to look at a few things. Some of the enforcement done in other cities like New York is really good, where they actually get citizens involved. And why not? You know, like, we don't have an army of bylaw officers. So there's some creative solutions that other cities have done that I think are worth looking at. And the money that goes into these things can be actually put into education, can be directed to climate change, whatever. So I think all of these things are worth looking at.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the point about the savings that the city can also achieve if we have a kind of collective, push to stop idling in our municipal vehicles where possible.
And I just paid my tax bill, and I think it is infuriating when you see this at $2 a liter, and I just saw two landscaping city officials sitting there with their windows down, happily idling away just a few days ago. It's just not necessary and very costly. Millions and millions of dollars, seriously.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you, Joan.
Okay.
So as you already queued up our next presenter, we have Paulina Pizarro from the Centertown Community Association.
Good morning, Chair, Vice Chair, Councillors, and City staff. I also have a deck to present, Chris. But I hope you're all doing well, and thank you for the time to speak with you. So my name is Paulina, and I'm here representing a working group of several Ottawa community associations who are concerned about idling in the city and are proposing some recommendations on how to strengthen our approach to idling and enforcing the existing bylaw. And many of those were reflected in the motion that Councillor Menard had read out earlier. So it's great to see that that synergy in place already. Next slide, please. So our working group is composed primarily of 4 community associations from Centertown, Glebe, Hintonburg, and Vanier, but we also have the support of Old Ottawa East and Old Ottawa South. The Glebe Community Association has done a lot of work on anti-idling campaigns, as Joan had mentioned. So this is really building on their efforts. And we've also been liaising with our local BIAs to garner their interest and support. Next slide, please. And the purpose of our recommendation which are elaborated on fully in a report that I'd also provided to the committee, is to support a complete bylaw review and update, which we now understand will be probably happening in the next term of council. We hope that the idling bylaw could be prioritized for an update since it's really quite out of date and out of step with recent commitments from the city, including the declaration of a climate emergency in 2019. We hope to see movement from the city that makes it clear that unnecessary idling is not acceptable in a livable city while we deal with a climate emergency that has an obvious impact on health and well-being. We've compared Ottawa's bylaw to bylaws and initiatives from other major cities, such as Toronto, Edmonton, Vancouver, and New York. To Councillor Menard's question earlier, all of these cities, their different programs have each of them have their own pros and cons. I would say Toronto, Vancouver, and New York, and Edmonton is like the four I just mentioned are maybe the strongest in different aspects. Our report goes into each of them and kind of compares it to what Ottawa does, but those I would say were some of the best proportioned, best positions, sorry. So all these cities have measures in place that Ottawa can emulate, so we don't have to be reinventing the wheel here. Next slide, please. I won't go into too much detail of each of our recommendations because we don't have time, but the first 5 deal directly with improvements to the bylaw text, and 2 of these we consider to be priorities. So reducing the temperature thresholds so that the idling bylaw is applicable for more of the year. As of right now, in an average year, it basically permits idling for close to half of a calendar year. And the second recommendation is making the fines for idling clearer and more of a deterrent. Next slide, please. Other recommendations for the text include reducing the time threshold, which currently allows idling up to 3 minutes, and reducing and clarifying the list of exemptions. And next slide, please. And writing clear definitions for relevant terms within the bylaw. Next slide, please. Recommendations 6 to 9 deal with improving the enforcement and engagement beyond just the bylaw text. And these include streamlining enforcement and reporting, as Joan had touched on earlier, and educating the public against idling through an anti-idling campaign, social media, and incorporation of anti-idling clauses into events and contracts. And the photo there is a campaign that New York had put on with Billy Idol, which I thought was very clever. Next slide, please. We also recommend applying anti-idling policy principles to city and LC transport vehicles, which, as the last presentation demonstrated, are not immune to idling. The bylaw does reference the internal policy from the city from June 2002, which could be amalgamated into the bylaw. I wasn't able to find a copy of it in my research, so I'm not sure what state it's in, but I did see that it was updated recently, so potential synergy there. And we also have a recommendation on drive-throughs, which we recognize are private property, but still do contribute emissions from idling cars. Next slide, please. So in summary, I invite you to peruse the report that had been submitted for your information and to inspire you to consider these changes to the bylaw now or in the near future. With that, I will wrap up. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on the topic. Thank you. Yes, Vice Chair.
All right, thank you, Paulina. Question from Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yeah, thank you, Paulina, and for your service as well on the Environmental Stewardship Advisory Committee. You always make a great contribution there, and that that group has, I think, lots of thought-provoking pieces that have come out from it, and we need to continue to make gains. And this is one of the areas. I guess the question would be, what are the kind of top things you can do? And you mentioned a whole kind of list of things, but this is such a hard issue because obviously education is a huge one. It's just reminding people, turn off your engine when you're not in need of it, but are there specific things you found in the research that Ottawa can be doing right away to kind of cut the emissions and curb the idling, given the number of tickets that we've seen? Bylaws not really being enforced a lot. It's a difficult one to enforce because someone might be there for 5 minutes or something, and you see it and might call it in. Well, it's going to take longer than that to get there for the bylaw officer. So what are you seeing as what's effective in stopping the behavior?
Definitely that education component. I mean, it could go even all the way up to like the province and kind of the driver training that people get as they're getting their licenses for the first time, including anti-idling education in those courses and tests that drivers have to do. Definitely signage. So Joan was mentioning a competition that was made to introduce signage at schools, but I mean, anti-idling signage can be put anywhere. I believe in Perth that as you're driving into the city, there's a sign that says that this is like the city doesn't tolerate idling, and kind of making it more clear that it is trying to reduce its environmental footprint and that everyone contributes to that footprint. Otherwise, I mean, when it comes to enforcement, it is tricky because, like you say, it is very much a time-sensitive item. Having citizens be able to call in or report idlers more easily is one item there. I think right now we have to go through 311, and then there's the whole process of a 311 agent dispatching to a bylaw officer, and then the bylaw officer having to go over and check it and scope it out. If we can do online reporting, maybe that's one thing. And differentiating between individuals and corporate vehicles idling is also a step, because there are kind of I think different ways that corporate vehicles can be handled than individual vehicles when it's just a private person. And I think clarifying really the time, the thresholds, and exemptions, because right now there are absolute cases where idling needs to happen, whether it's for an emergency situation or a vehicle is actively being operated and needs that energy. So clarifying those exemptions and specifying exactly what is considered idling, so making it clear for bylaw to know what they have to enforce, and then expanding it to other things that maybe aren't currently in the bylaw. So anything that uses fossil fuels. Toronto's bylaw, for example, touches on boats, and of course we have a lot of kind of areas for boating around the city of Ottawa, so that's a consideration that currently is missing in our bylaw. I'm just thinking
That is a lot. That's great.
Yeah, sorry. And then maybe my last point is just making, I mentioned earlier, but incorporating anti-idling considerations into events and contracts. So if the city is going to be contracting a lot of vehicular work to a company, making sure that it's clear in the contract that there is an expectation not to idle for events taking place on city property. If you're going to be catering or food trucks or whatever it may be, incorporating that as well. Sorry, I'll wrap up.
Thank you so much. No, that's so helpful. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks, Chair.
All right, thank you, I'll for the question. So thank you, Paulina, for your time today. So questions to staff. I know that I know Councillor Eglin wanted to make a comment just because there is a reference to Ottawa Public Health in here, because while we can't direct Ottawa Public Health and the board to do anything, the motion from us specifically requests consideration of something, which we can't do. So I'll go to Councillor Eglin first, and then also if anyone has any questions for staff on this.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with you. The motion does say request, and that is appropriate in the circumstances. And I understand the importance of having this discussion. It's too bad that this could have been raised at the Board of Health meeting last night, which Member Menard is part of as well, and we could have had that discussion because we don't meet again until September. Fortunately, Dr. Etches is available for this meeting. She's monitoring this meeting. If anybody has any questions for her around this, she's available to answer them. I guess the concern is around some of the things that are being requested of public health. For example, public health, when consulted, my understanding indicated that they would amplify by way of social media any programs or education that city bylaw staff put together, and I think that's still the position of public health. So we're not generally in the role of developing signage for bylaw enforcement or education. That's not something that public health generally does. But my understanding is that public health staff had indicated that they're prepared to help amplify any message that city staff puts together. So again, Dr. Etches is available. I don't know if perhaps the motion could be reworded somewhat to reflect what public health, in accordance with what Dr. Etches had to say to me this morning, is able to do or is prepared to do in these circumstances, and in terms of what they would normally do in terms of interactions with the city and bylaw. So I don't know if that's something that Councillor Menard / Member Menard is prepared to consider, some wording that reflects better the discussions that, to my understanding, that took place and the feedback that was provided by public health.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Councillor wants to respond to that. I mean, ultimately, even a rewording of the final piece of it, I'm not sure changes it to a significant degree, because it is just a consideration, and it does speak to a collaboration with the City of Ottawa. The only thing I think, to your concern, Councillor, is that it would purport to isolate the Board of Health as the lead on it, and you're suggesting that the City of Ottawa should be the lead on it. But
what I'm suggesting is I think we want this to be a good news story. I don't want this going to the Board of Health in the fall and the Board of Health saying we're not comfortable with this recommendation, so we have to play with it at the Board of Health. I think if we had a friendlier recommendation from committee, then that might be a better way to do it, and a more positive story all around how different facets of the city can get together and work on the problem. Again, as I say, Dr. Etches is available if anybody's got any questions about public health's role in this particular matter.
Thanks. Councillor Menard, do you want to respond just because it's your motion?
Yeah, just, I mean, absolutely open, of course, to changes that better outline the role. We worked with staff on this motion, and that's why it's in front of us the way it is. But I'm of course open if there's some suggested wording that bylaw services and emergency protective services and Ottawa Public Health can agree on to make it to have clarity. I'm of course open to that.
Could I make a suggestion, Chair, that after comments that we put this down the list, and then I can liaise again with Dr. Etches and we can come up with some wording to put forward? Does that make sense? Well,
I don't even think you need to consider too much. I mean, you could just have it be that, therefore be resolved that council requests that the committee, anyway, request that a public education signage campaign be developed through collaboration with Ottawa Board of Health, City of Ottawa staff, including. I mean, you could just flip it around and have the consideration for the development of the program.
Again, I think the message that came from public health was they would amplify a program that the city put together.
Right. So that to me, that fits within collaboration.
That's different from what
nitpicking.
Well, I think it's different. Collaboration suggests to me that they would be developing it as well. What they're saying is they will amplify the program that the city comes up with. But again, I've said several times, Dr. Etches is available to clarify if people wish that to happen.
Okay. Well, first we'll go to Councillor Hughley.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a quick question. The point was made that there was 10 tickets issued, but my experience with our bylaw people is they don't go into a situation looking to write a ticket. So I'm more interested in how many warnings they may have given out that, they may walk up to someone that's idling and say, hey, you're going to get a ticket if you don't turn that car off because we have an idling bylaw. And I would think in most cases that car stops idling right away. So I don't think it's fair on our staff to measure them only by the number of tickets issued. If there's someone available that could give us some kind of indication as to how many warnings and confirm my impression that they would warn before they would ticket, I would appreciate that.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Hughley. I believe Roger Chapman is on the line and would be happy to respond to that.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So there's about 40 warnings that have been issued. And I know that sounds extremely low, but again, I just want to explain that, many times when we're responding to these complaints, warnings can only be issued when there's a violation. So First of all, we need to arrive, be able to substantiate that there is a violation. So they have to be idling longer than 3 hours, or sorry, 3 minutes. And a lot of people, aren't aware of all the exemptions that are in the bylaw. So, when we do these investigations, sometimes it's, because of temperature, there's no violation. Because of the type of vehicle or the activity that's taking place, there is an exemption in place, so no violation. So, although there's been 4,000 plus complaints over the last 15 years or so, very few warnings and tickets have been issued because it's very difficult to substantiate a violation.
Okay, so Roger, 40 written warnings, as you said, there has to be a violation before they can do the warnings. By chance, do you keep track or have any sense of how many times one of your officers may speak to somebody that's idling a car and give them like the verbal warning, okay, don't go past this time?
Yes, so the data that we've pulled so far, in regards to those 4,000 complaints, is that 40 actual warnings were issued and 10 charges. So, the other complaints are when we arrive, the vehicles left the scene. So we're not able to investigate any further, or in many cases, one of the exemptions applies. So there is no violation. So no opportunity to issue a warning.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And Roger, just to confirm, sorry, just while you're there, I just confirm this is be something that you'd be looking at. I have to assume at some point you would have been looking at updating this bylaw regardless, because it is now 15 years old. So with this direction, you'll seek to make this a part of your work plan for next term.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I'll turn this over to Valerie to speak to that. It is a direction to the public policy development.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Valerie to jump on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, this direction would cause us to include a review of this bylaw as part of next term of council's bylaw review work plan. The entire bylaw review work plan, as developed by staff, would be coming to council for approval as early as possible in 2023.
Okay, all right, thank you. Councillor Brockington?
Just to confirm, is this general questions or specific about?
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to ask staff, if I may, the chair, how is it communicated to staff who drive city vehicles about the idling bylaw? There are oodles of examples of city vehicles I observe idling, not during -40 weather, not those extreme weather, but on a daily basis. If I go out, there are vehicles idling. So just from a information perspective, how are city staff informed and reminded about idling?
Thank you, Chair, and Councillor Brockington as well. Great question. I'm not aware of any proactive notification. It's certainly something we'd be looking at, and I think it's a great suggestion. Just like any other bylaw, whether it's no smoking in the workplace, etc. Staff are just expected to actually follow through and follow the laws as well while they're working. However, I believe a proactive communication strategy would be very helpful in this case. So we'll certainly take it away.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And I am willing to accept that some people actually don't know. I'm willing to agree with that statement, but I do believe that the employer has a responsibility to remind employees about expectations and the many benefits of not idling. So if that can just be noted and implemented, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Councillor Eglite. Now, just a suggestion, this doesn't come to council until July 6th. I'm pretty sure we could probably sort out the final piece of the resolution between now and then to get the wording.
I have some wording that Dr. Etches just sent me after consulting with staff, and I'll just read it quickly. And if it's agreeable, we can to the mover, we can share that. Therefore, be it resolved that Council requests the Ottawa Board of Health consider collaborating with City of Ottawa staff, including public information and media relations and emergency and protective services, to amplify a public education and signage campaign to reduce unnecessary idling. If that's acceptable, Councillor Menard, I can have that sent to the clerk and have the motion modified accordingly.
I think just given what the chair has said, because here's the thing, Councillor Eglai, we did have an opportunity to review amongst emergency protective services and also with the Ottawa Public Health and the clerk's office before this came forward. I think what you're saying is likely friendly, but I just want to get to the crux of it before council. So we've got a good understanding of what we're talking about here. It seems like there's maybe a willingness or unwillingness to potentially help lead or collaborate on this one. So I'm open
there's
to.
There's no unwillingness, Councillor. No
need for back and forth, guys.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to make it clear.
Let's just take it off. Let's just take it off, and let's work on it between now and then. We also want to make sure the recommendation does actually lead to the development of a public education and signage.
And that's my point exactly.
Yeah. So because we want to make sure the wording captures it, and not that the direction is that we amplify a message that never actually gets created. So let's just pull it off for now. We can, in fairness, we can even refer that one to council. We won't vote on that second recommendation. We'll just refer it to council, and then we'll come back on and we'll fiddle with the wording to make it amenable to all sides.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Yeah. I just don't want to do it on the fly because I want to hear from emergency protective services as well and just get on the same page of this thing. So
yeah, agreed. Okay, any other questions for staff? Any comments? Anything whatsoever? Seeing none, can we approve the motion from Councillor Menard regarding a review of the anti-idling bylaw, and not the education piece, because we'll come back to that.
Approved.
Approved. Do I have to refer the other part? Yeah, I guess we just refer on referral of the second resolution to council. On referral.
Carried.
Carried.
Great. Thank you very much. So on to item number 1, which is the Climate Change Master Plan, Climate Vulnerability and Risk Assessment. We have Julia Robinson here to provide a presentation to us on this item. And then we will, we have 3 delegations, which we'll go to after Julia's presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, councillors. Just checking you can hear me all right. Great. And Chris, I think you're going to pull up the presentation. So thank you for the opportunity to present this morning. My name is Julia Robinson, and I'm here on behalf of the Climate Change and Resiliency team. And I will be making the presentation today, but I'm joined by representatives from several departments if there are any specific questions. In today's presentation, I will provide a brief background on how this project supports the Climate Change Master Plan and Climate Resiliency Strategy, as well as an overview of the scope of the project. The bulk of the presentation will focus on report findings, including the priority climate risks. Next slide, please. The report includes the following recommendations: receive the Climate Vulnerability and Risk Assessment Technical Report, direct staff to develop the Climate Resiliency Strategy, direct all departments to consider the findings in city plans, policies, and programs, as well as the strategic plan, and direct staff to consider resourcing needs, both to develop the strategy and to accelerate actions on known risks. Next slide, please. The project is a key deliverable of the Climate Change Master Plan and responds to the 2019 Climate Emergency Declaration. Since the approval of the Climate Change Master Plan in January 2020, the city has done a substantial amount of work on reducing GHG emissions through energy evolution. The Climate Vulnerability and Risk Assessment is a key milestone in preparing for the impacts of climate change and building climate resilience. Next slide, please. The purpose of the climate resiliency strategy is to assess how Ottawa is vulnerable to climate change and identify strategies to mitigate the greatest risks. Next slide. There are 3 key phases to the project. The first phase is understanding how Ottawa's climate is expected to change. The climate projection study was completed in 2020 as a partnership with the National Capital Commission and with technical advice from Environment and Climate Change Canada. It used the latest climate modeling and science to provide a comprehensive analysis of changes in temperature, precipitation, and extreme events until the year 2100. Phase 2, the climate vulnerability and risk assessment, is the focus of the report being presented today. We'll then start developing the climate resiliency strategy and propose to return to committee and council by the end of 2023. Next slide, please. The scope of the climate vulnerability and risk assessment is broad. It included understanding and assessing the impacts of a changing climate on our community, infrastructure, environment, and economy. It assessed risks and opportunities both for gradual change, such as rising temperatures and changing seasons, as well as extreme events, such as floods, tornadoes, or ice storms. And while the starting point has been looking at impacts on city services, we also worked with key external stakeholders and sought public input to understand the impacts on the community more broadly. Next slide, please. 12 city task teams were set up to identify climate impacts, discuss existing adaptation measures, and assess vulnerability and risk. A key objective of this approach was to build understanding across all city departments to lay the foundation to embed climate preparedness in all city services. Next slide. In addition to the internal engagement, the project involved both public and stakeholder engagement. A dedicated Engage Ottawa page was established in March 2021, and we received more than 500 survey responses from residents, businesses, and organizations. We held 5 targeted stakeholder workshops with about 50 representatives from key organizations and partners. Next slide. So this slide summarizes the number of priority climate risks. Approximately 150 climate impacts were assessed related to community, infrastructure, environment, and economy. 40 priority risks have been identified that need action in the next 1 to 3 years. Another 25 require action in the next 4 to 7 years. And the remaining risks will be monitored to see if current adaptive measures are sufficient. The next series of slides discuss the priority risks for each of the 5 climate hazard categories. The report also presents this information on the risks by the 12 focus areas or sectors. Next slide, please. In terms of temperature, Ottawa will be warmer and more humid across all seasons and get increasingly warm over the decades. The climate projections examine trends across 3 time horizons. It's just come to my attention. That's the slide we want to be on. Thank you. So as I was saying, the climate projections examine the trends across 3 time horizons compared to a historical baseline of 1981 to 2010. So we are currently in the 2030s time horizon. Note in particular the increase in the number of days above 30 degrees. This will increase from a historical average of 11 per year to 28 per year in the next decades and continue to rise drastically. The heat spells will also happen earlier and later, as we experienced in mid-May of this year. Next slide, please. So these are the top risks that relate to extreme heat, drought, and humidity. From a health perspective, extreme heat affects everyone, but certain groups are much more vulnerable. These include low-income populations, especially those with poor access to air conditioning or cooling, and those who are homeless or precariously housed. It also includes older adults and children and people who live alone, people with pre-existing health conditions, people who work outside, and athletes. Reducing the impacts of heat on people affects many city services: health, community social services, parks and recreation, and transportation. The top heat risks to infrastructure relate to the need for additional cooling in buildings. And this is an example where the community risks are higher than for city assets, as many schools, low-income housing, and long-term care facilities lack air conditioning. Top heat risks also relate to the natural environment as well as agricultural systems. Next slide, please. As temperatures rise, our seasons will shift and we'll see more freeze-thaw cycles in the winter. Winter freeze-thaws can be more damaging as they occur when the ground is frozen and prone to more icy conditions. Next slide. 8 of the top risks relate to seasonal variability and change. Warmer seasons will create the conditions for more or new pests and invasive species, which can greatly harm natural environments and agriculture. This also creates conditions for new or intensified disease vectors and illnesses like Lyme disease or West Nile virus. Our economy will also be affected by reduced winter tourism and recreation. And as I mentioned, freeze-thaw will affect many kinds of infrastructure assets, impacting both operations and maintenance as well as asset renewal. Next slide. In terms of precipitation, we can expect more rain, but it won't be distributed evenly across the seasons, with relatively less rainfall in the summer. We're also going to see more intense rainfall or heavy rains, and in the long run, there will be much less snow. Next slide. Not surprisingly, the priority risks relate to various types of flooding. This includes riverine flooding, overland or inland flooding from overwhelmed stormwater systems, as well as sewer backups. The top risks relate to direct damage to property and infrastructure, reduced access when roads or paths are flooded, impacts to the natural environment, physical, mental, and financial health impacts, especially to those who are financially strained or have poor social supports, and agricultural impacts. Next slide. We don't have statistics for extreme weather events because climate models are not effective for predicting the frequency of extreme weather. However, the climate projection study concluded that increasing temperature and precipitation create the conditions for more freezing rain and extreme weather events like severe winter storms, tornadoes, wildfire, and drought. We know that across Canada, insurance costs for natural disasters are on the rise and average around $1 billion per year. And Ottawa, of course, has experienced these impacts with the floods and tornadoes, the devastating 1998 ice storm, and the severe derecho storm last month. Next slide. The top extreme weather risks relate both to direct damage to people and property and also indirect damage from power outages. More freezing rain and ice is of concern from a health and safety perspective, as well as winter maintenance of roads, sidewalks, and paths. And while we have excellent capacity to deal with emergency events, the increased severity or frequency of extreme weather events will strain emergency and social services, both those provided by the city and provided by community agencies. Last month's severe storm and extensive power outage is a clear example of this. Repeated or sequential events will also place additional strain on more at-risk populations, especially if access to social services is disrupted. This could be by power outages or unsafe road conditions, for example. And again, these result in increased physical, mental, and financial health impacts. There are also indirect impacts on all city services due to more frequent redeployment to assist during an emergency. And our economy will be affected due to disruptions in the local business. Next slide, please. The last climate hazard category is global climate change. In addition to considering the impacts of local climate patterns, Ottawa will also be affected by climate change experienced around the world. The top risks relate to supply chain instability, causing increased costs or reduced availability of goods and services. These risks affect all services and sectors, as well as populations who are less able to cope with the additional costs. Next slide, please. The final few slides focus on early actions, gaps, and next steps. While the climate resiliency strategy is being developed, we have identified opportunities to take action to mitigate known climate risks through current and planned projects, plans, and programs. So for example, the official plan includes new policies on extreme heat, flood risk mitigation, and sustainable and resilient design. Master plans are currently considering climate change as they are being developed. Detailed climate risk assessments have been completed for the water and wastewater treatment plants, and specific adaptation plans are currently being developed. And final example is that Ottawa Public Health is leading a climate change and health vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan with an initial focus on extreme heat. Next slide, please. The climate vulnerability and risk assessment also identified broader gaps and opportunities. Some of these can be addressed through the development of the climate resiliency strategy, pending sufficient resources. Other early actions need to be considered as part of 2023 work plans and budgets or through specific funding proposals. For example, this work involves assessment of specific assets, analysis of which specific communities or populations might be disproportionately affected, and community education on climate risks so people can take action to protect themselves and their businesses. Next slide, please. That brings me to the end of the presentation. The next step in the project is to develop the climate resiliency strategy, and this is planned to be brought to committee and council by the end of 2023. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Appreciate your presentation and work on this item. So we'll go now to our delegations, and we welcome back Joan Freeman. Oh, I need some more councillors on screen, by the way. 4 just isn't gonna cut it. There we go. Thank you. So we have Joan Freeman, Cecile Wilson, and Mary Hegan. I mean, we should have those people. They are around.
He's coming in. She's in the list of attendees, Chair.
Oh, no worries. I trust you, Chris. I was just, trying to fill the dead air.
You did say something earlier about your Saturday Night Live impressions. That'd be a good time for that.
No, I don't want that recorded on YouTube forever and ever and ever. I need to have a career after this,
Ms. Freeman just needs to accept the prompt to be switched over to panelist.
I have accepted it about 15 times.
Oh, you're here now. We can hear you now.
Yeah, you can hear me, but for some reason I'm not showing up. I don't know what's going on. Join as panelist. Let me try again. Technology.
We can hear you, but we are receiving an error code for some reason.
That's weird. I didn't do anything but pour a coffee since the last chat.
Well, we punted you to the other room. That's why. And then we let you back in when we want.
I believe she's as a panelist now, Mr. Chair.
There we go.
Hello, back again. Well, I don't know a Saturday Night Live routine, so I'm going to leave that to Scott. I've got a deck here. Just want to say I'm speaking again on behalf of cafes on this important next piece in implementing the climate change master plan. And I'd like to say that the focus here is really on the community and citizens issues. Cafes has heard from numerous members about adaptation, and they are worried about the title, How Protected Are We from Climate Impacts? Next page, please. Cafes, but the point here is that we represent over 50 community associations, and we've heard concerns from representatives all across the city, north, south, east, west, urban, suburban, and rural communities. Next slide, please. Again, about cafes. The point to note here, I'm not quite sure why this is so low on the screen. We're missing a cutoff here. The third point's not showing up. But anyway, the highlighted points are important here because what we're trying to say here is that cafes represents local groups and people, which are going to be important for local solutions to climate impacts. Local solutions will many of the solutions will be local and not citywide. And the other point is that cafes is a different voice and in some cases trusted differently than the city. So I think that's important to consider. Next slide, please. I will be briefly touching on 5 points with the lens of community concerns and the desired actions we want to see. Next slide, please. We are all aware of the most recent climate effects from the severe storm a month ago today. It was costly and it made people realize that impacts are worsening. They are exponentially more costly the longer we wait, and citizens are very concerned and want action. Next slide, please. About the 6 recommendations, staff has worked hard and I applaud Julie and her team. They've done a good job with what they have, but I do think we want to comment on some of the recommendations. We're glad to see the CVRA, but it's 2 years late and it's a study, it's not actions. the plan, or this will really not be coming forward. The plan with the money and the actions won't be coming forward until the end of 2023, which means it won't affect budgets and be in budgets till 2025. We believe it's a work plan and it should be done and ready by 2023, especially for those 40 priority risks, which, direct quote from the report, are identified in the report that require action within 1 to 3 years to protect the livability and prosperity of Ottawa. If they're not going to be in the budget till 2025, we are knowingly putting Ottawa livability and prosperity at risk. Next slide, please. The community's biggest concerns, from reading between the lines, and I have to say that we do think the staff's done a good job, but basically we're concerned about some of the larger themes here. There's really been very little or no buy-in from senior management or politician, which explains the delays and the lack of budget. The community is generally not aware or engaged. Yes, there's been stakeholders, but there's 1 million people in Ottawa, and most of them are very worried and don't know what to do. Governance has been talked about for over 3 years, but there's been very little change in the siloing and the bringing everybody to work together. This is a citywide report. Solutions need to be local, and there, as Julia pointed out, there's some very big gaps. Next slide. The solutions are basically not surprising. They are 3 big areas: governance, capital investments, and mobilizing the citizens. Specifically, we need a senior level climate czar. There'll be more people talking about that, and all the governance actions that are in the climate change master plan. We need funding immediately of all of those 40 high risks, and the citizens need to be communicated and engaged with. Next and final slide. So the citizens, I don't want to be Cassandra here, but we are not prepared. We are not investing properly. And as a result, at this stage, the city's prosperity and livability is at risk. But this is not all bad news. This is a turning point. We can't kick this to the next council. The public wants action, and Cafes is ready to help. We can help mobilize, we can help inform, and most importantly, we can help build trust to work together. And we really think that you need to move forward much more boldly and look at some of these recommendations in a different way. Next and final slide, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you, Joan. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, but do appreciate your presentation and your involvement, obviously with Cafes and other organizations over the years.
Okay.
All right, thank you. No problem. We'll move now to Cecile Wilson, followed by Mary Hegan.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
I sure can.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair and councillors, for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I would like to begin by commending City Council for commissioning this report. It is critical we have a clear picture of the risks that all of us as inhabitants of Ottawa can expect to face as a result of our destabilized climate, so that we can prepare for and respond to this existential crisis with the seriousness it deserves. I also applaud the introductory paragraph of the executive summary for its straightforward statement of the problem. These impacts will continue to intensify. Ottawa will become, quote, warmer, wetter, and have more unpredictable extreme weather events, unquote, like floods, heat waves, and tornadoes. And I just want to note here that the following comments I'm going to make are in reference to Appendix C, the priority risks for all hazards. Perhaps you were as disconcerted as I was when I saw that 22 impacts identified in Appendix C were classified as high risk for either the city or the community, and that 7 of those were high risk for both city and community. Even more alarming to me was that 7 impacts were classified as very high risk for either the city or the community, and 6 of those applied to both city and community. That makes a total of 29 impacts that are identified as either high or very high risk. Honestly, I had not expected there to be so many. What makes these hazards or impacts even more unsettling is that none of these impacts occurs in isolation. For example, the very high risk of decreased agricultural yields due to extreme heat or drought conditions or late planting is compounded by the very high risk of the spread of invasive plants and agricultural pests. These combined risks pose a magnified hazard for both commercial croplands and home gardens. And I'd like to point out that I personally am in a privileged position. I have a lot of resources to deal with the effects of climate change, but as the report thankfully identifies, so many people in our community do not. Speaking from my own perspective, as someone who likes winter and hopes to live another 10 plus years, I'm in my 60s, I am saddened to see projections for the 2030s of a 10% decrease in snowfall and a 13% increase in winter freeze-thaw situations that destroy what good snow we may receive. Situations like these contribute to the very high risk of lessened outdoor sports and recreation like skiing, skating, and snowmobiling due to a shortened and compromised winter season. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have already experienced missing out on skating on the canal or skiing or snowmobiling through the woods or just taking a pleasant walk in the winter weather because of a sudden rise in temperature that makes your outing less than ideal or even dangerous. With our experience of the pandemic, we are all quite aware of the positive aspects of exercising outdoors in a safe environment. Conversely, as someone who does not do well when the humidex is high, I am dismayed to see the risk of, quote, an increased number and severity of heat-related health and safety issues to emergency responders, disproportionately impacted populations, and active recreation users, end quote. This is identified as very high for both city and the community. When you consider that the first responders are the people we rely on for help when we experience severe heat events, this also has a negative compounding effect. And this is to say nothing of the deadly threats that tornadoes, windstorms, and floodings can pose. These examples bring me to a concern I have about the report, or more accurately, about reporting to the public about the report. Like most reports referencing climate change, the climate change vulnerability and risk assessment mentions that we need to keep the rise in Earth's global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. On page 1 of the executive summary, the chart indicates that by the 2030s, we can expect the average temperature to be 1.8 degrees higher than normal. For a city that has often experienced minus 30 degrees temperature, a rise of 1.8 degrees doesn't seem like a problem. It may even be perceived as a welcome change. But when you focus instead on the effects that the rise in temperature brings, that is a lot more ominous and threatening. Ms. Robinson also already pointed out that we can expect 28 days in a year of extreme heat that is over 30 degrees Celsius. So when the city communicates to the public the risks that we can expect to face now in coming decades, I request that you convey the effects listed in this report in a way that personalizes these effects. We need to hear them communicated in a way that we can easily imagine what these impacts will mean for our daily lives and the prices we can expect to pay if we don't prepare for these likely weather effects. And finally, while I'm really happy to see the community taking action on mitigation, it's also important that we continue to reduce our emissions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecile. Question from Councillor Menard.
Thank you, Cecile, for being here and presenting today. I agree. It's alarming what we're seeing in front of us and the risks that are coming to our city in only a short few years. We've already seen the risks manifest themselves in lots of councillors' wards right across the city with multiple emergencies that have happened this term of council. I'm wondering what your understanding is of the funds that are being put towards this as a priority. This report's supposed to be coming back in the next term of council. But in the meantime, I'm wondering if you have any comments or insights into the funding that is needed right now to start a revolving fund, something that can start to contribute to reducing these risks in this instance.
Thanks, Councillor Menard. I really wish Angela were here today, but she's at her son's graduation in Kingston. My background is not in funds at all, and I have to admit that my awareness of what goes on at City is, it's just really recent that I've become more interested in and concerned about City functioning and politics. So unfortunately, I can't speak to anything about funding other than I really do hope that the council allocates funds to be able to carry out these actions that we need, because as the report clearly points out, this is a threat to citizens of Ottawa personally, but also a threat to our economy and economic stability. So I think even if I don't want to disregard personal experiences, in fact, I'm arguing for taking those into consideration. But even if you're just basing it on numbers, it needs to be well-funded. Sorry, I don't have any expertise.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I appreciate you being here and speaking to the risks, and I thank you for that answer, which illuminates part of the issue we're trying to tackle, which is a lot of our funding is in silos in different departments. We don't have a lot of focus on this budget for the risks that we're seeing in front of us now in terms of mitigation, adaptation. And the ones you've highlighted in your presentation are the risks we need to step up. And I think we have a great plan, but we need that funding to follow. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's part of one of the recommendations here is to ensure that climate resiliency is part of the term of council priorities and strategic plan for the next term of council. We know that a lot of the funding in the budget comes from term of council priorities. We've always had, I shouldn't say always, but in my time, we've always had climate as a term of council priority, but we haven't funded it as much as we obviously should. We have, well, with the next item, you'll see the main source of funding is something that we can't guarantee, which is the challenge. On the specific items within Energy Evolution, obviously we have bigger funding through other departments and other projects, but that's the nature of this is that it's across so many different departments, and it's that's why one of the recommendations we've heard in the past is having a climate budget so that we can properly track this stuff and understand where the money's going and where it needs to be going to identify it. Okay, so no other questions for Cecile. So thank you, Councillor Bernard, and thank you, Cecile. And our final speaker on this item is Burris Rapids' very own Mary Hegan.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Scott, for being there. Scott's my counselor, and I'm going to say right off the top, thank you, Scott, for your years of hard work out here, and I think we're going to miss you after the next election. But anyway, let's talk about some immediate needs. I'm speaking as an individual. I am active with a number of community-wide organizations addressing climate action, such as cafes, the People of Fishes Plan, Ecology Ottawa, the Ottawa River Keeper, and it goes on and on. But I really want to talk personally this morning to add to Julia Robinson's 2 reports before us and what has to happen, I would say almost immediately and next. And I want to personalize this because I think we're at that point now on climate action and resiliency. I was part of some of the consultations that Julia has held with community representatives, writing report number 2. And I'm going to say right away that we like the overall city view. We like the city to be there for us, but we're far from being ready. And I'm saying that in the sense that the community has a major role. And this is local neighborhoods, local community associations, church groups, our BIAs, all of that. The kind of thinking that we brought to our new official plan when we talked about livable, walkable local communities. And it's all very interrelated. And I think we have a lot going for us, but we have to personalize our actions now. I read from my neighborhood in rural Ottawa South, there are fears. They're very immediate. If I haven't lost my mature tree to protect me from heat, and all the other things that trees do for us, when will my turn come? That is the fear. And the other fear is the community feels deep down that we are not ready amongst ourselves to do and play the community role. So I have a number of suggestions for immediate action. And by the way, I can't wait till the end of 2023 because from a public health point of view and the fears in people's minds and the wanting to be ready and prepared and to know what their responsibilities are going to be are really with us now. It'll come up during the municipal election because it's uppermost in people's minds. So the suggestions I have, yes, we should have a climate czar at the city, but I'm going to say that every councillor is going to have to be the climate czar as well, to pull this all together, community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood. This includes bringing people that are residents or to be residents with their local businesses and their local amenities together to really plan. My neighbors are talking about, we want to start talking now about a community action plan for my neighborhood. It's a little bit like the Crime Prevention Council, when we set up telephone networks and all that kind of thing, and having them in place before the next windstorm, before the next flood, before the next drought. Secondly, as much as the city overview plan is good and helpful to your various departments, and I want to thank Julia for bringing the various departments together because I think that's where the best action is going to be. If you go neighborhood by neighborhood, the risks in those reports may not be reflected. They may not be the priority. And one of the priorities coming up is people talking about, can I trust? Can I trust my city to let me know if there's a new development plan, is it going to be contrary to our community local action plan and how we're going to prepare to be ready? Are we going to be invited to the table very early on and not just be ready when reports go to committee and the work is done and a lot of the commitments have been made? Those are the real fears of people. And for example, out in my area of rural Ottawa, we are learning very quickly the value of wetlands, both the significant wetlands, but more importantly, the non-significant wetlands. Your latest flood plan has a recommendation from our conservation authorities to protect all wetlands. It's not something you can take away from one community and stick it somewhere else as a mitigating factor. Every community needs all their wetlands to absorb the flooding, to absorb the biodiversity, to absorb all those things. And we have to learn from your staff very, very specifically how we as a community can look after our wetlands and our shorelines and protect them day in and day out. And that's the collaborative effort I'm talking about. Funding. I think the time is now to have a special fund to show the city is really serious in working with communities, for communities to do their startup work and making their own local plans, and to do it in collaboration with all the good staff work going on. It could be a startup fund. And that is really important. Also, we have the community-wide community organizations who are ready to be your contractors, to be your consultants, to be hired to work with our networks and our community associations. We need an annual citizen climate assembly, much like we did back in the 1980s in writing a green plan for Ottawa. So these are things that we can do now. They're small cost items, but there has to be an avenue available to work with all city staff. And I'm thinking particularly of the Board of Health. I'm thinking of transportation. I'm thinking of the planning department and all the development applications they are receiving immediately. And it goes on and on. So I hope that you will take up our community offer to work with the city.
Thank you, Mary. And we have a question from Councillor McKinney.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Mary. Actually, you did address in your comments the questions that the question I had around funding. I do want to just emphasize, though, and I'm glad that you're here from a rural area. Often we, I mean, this is a very large city, very diverse city in terms of geography as well. And I represent, as you may know, the downtown, and we worry about our trees. We don't have a very healthy tree canopy. We have dozens that come down for different reasons every year. And for example, my spring planting plan from the city is 21 trees this summer. So it's so inadequate, but it's very interesting to hear you talk about that tree that you need in the rural area to keep you cool and to capture carbon, et cetera, and all of the things, healthy things that trees do. So I really do appreciate hearing from you. Just on funding, I know you did touch on it. I guess I will assume then, or I'll ask you, do you think that as a city we have sufficient funding in place to address the risks that we have in front of us, the immediate risks that we have in front of us, even if we were to pull it from all of the different silos that we point to? Do you, as a resident and somebody who thinks about this, feel that the funding is sufficient and growing sufficiently?
I'm going to say, without any financial figures in front of me, obviously not. These are big bucks. And every time we have a storm, it's very big bucks to do the cleanup. I am talking about preparedness, upfront organization, working relationships. Take both these reports that Julia has been talking about. Most of the people in my community have never heard about them. They don't know how much they're personalized to my community, to my area. Yet we work very hard to look after woodlots. We work very hard to look after shorelines, wetlands, rivers, streams, all that kind of thing. So we're learning very quickly, and we have a lot more to learn. What we don't know is the relationships at the city. We don't know who's doing what at the city and what we can count on. We don't know who can correct us when we have a misinformation. So this is all networking. This is all communications. I am told by my computer backup person out here in rural Ottawa that I live in a dead zone when it gets to digital information. Scott Moffat knows all about this, and it's hard to fix. But don't assume that we're online. And our greatest fear is that a storm comes through here. There's rain, there's winds, there's trees on our roofs, and we have no way of communicating. We don't know what's happening next door because we're not in high rises. We're not on those solid streets. It's very different in different parts of Ottawa. And I feel that for the next step in the resilience strategy is the city has to map from a community perspective, what are the priorities for these communities? How can you help us now not a year from now, get ready. I feel the communities want to take that responsibility on, but we just need to know that we are partner with the city in doing that.
Thanks, thanks, Mary. I really do agree with you. It's something that we need to tackle as a city, citywide, but we do have to understand how these risks impact every different community and work together to ensure that we are looking at mitigating those risks for everyone across the city, but they are very specific to different communities. So I really do appreciate that perspective. Thank you. Thanks for coming out. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, it can certainly be challenging in the rural area when you have certain situations happen like last week or a couple weeks ago. I had one of my constituents who still had running water and still had good cell signal and stuff because they live near a tower. They were upset because I wasn't communicating as well as my urban counterparts. I didn't bother getting into the weeds of letting them know that I had no power, no cell signal, no water, no anything, completely removed from society. Plus, my car picked up a flat tire during the storm when I was picking my son up from work at his no power work establishment. So I had no car for a good 3 days during that storm too. So I was like completely disconnected until the Tuesday of the storm, which is an interesting dynamic in the rural area that you don't always consider. And then the part that we often forget, and of course, Councillor Egline knows this, Councillor Brockton knows this, some of the pockets in the city that have well water is the whole process of bucketing your sump pump into the back of your toilet so you can keep flushing your toilet during power outages. Super exciting times. So thank you, Councillor McKenney. Thank you, Mary, for being here. Appreciate it. It is good. It is good to have someone from the rural area that comes and speaks to us about issues and whatnot, how it impacts them too. So thank you, Mary. Okay, so that's it for delegations. Any questions to staff? Obviously, what we have in front of us is, it's a bit of a check-in, but it's direction to go away and come back and do more. There is the next item does speak to actually some funding of the elements through this that will advance some of these projects in the short term. So we aren't neglecting those. But Councillor Egline?
Thanks, Chair. First of all, I wanted to start off by thanking staff. I think it's quite comprehensive what they put together, and I thank them for the briefings that we've received over the last number of days leading up to the meeting. I have the dubious distinction of representing one of the wards that appears to be a magnet for wind and tornado storms. So for my area, it's very important that we have these discussions. And I was pleased during the briefings to hear that staff are quite open to speaking to community associations, community groups as they go forward, especially from the most impacted areas to find out what can be done better, what the needs are. So that is appreciated. I'm not sure that this question fits in, Chair, and if it doesn't, just let me know. But I don't know if it sort of builds on one of the comments we heard from the last delegation. And that's the issue of communications. I know it's something we all struggled with after the various storm events. I know Councillor Gower was going door to door with materials. You can't always do that. That's not always an effective way to do it. It's not always a safe way to do it. After the tornado, certainly we had those discussions with city staff, and it certainly wasn't safe to send people onto some streets and some properties to share a pamphlet or information. So I'm just wondering, again, in terms of the proposal that's put forward, has any thought been given to when bad things happen, when it hits the fan, so to speak, how we can have consistent communications about what is available to residents? We have all the best plans in the world as to what we can do to help you and what resources they are, but if the community doesn't know about it. So I'm wondering if there's been any discussion. I know after the tornado, we had some discussion at council around working out an arrangement with one or two of the local radio stations, which tend to be the most consistent. You can have a battery or crank radio to connect, where there'd be a fixed time, for example, on after storm events. So every hour on the hour, there'd be a brief report about what's available and what's going on. So has any thought been given to how we package all the good work that you've done to make sure that people in the moment are able to access the information that they need and the resources that they need to respond to whatever the weather event is?
So I'm not sure who's responding. I do believe.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's the right place to ask the question here, but
I believe we're getting an update on this at council, if not tomorrow, in the near future, to talk about the storm recovery and whatnot. It probably is the right place to frame that question.
I just wanted to build on what I think. I guess she was your constituent, the last delegate who was here, because that is a problem certainly in the rural areas, but in the Glens, for example, there was no internet. There's some places in my ward that still have no internet. So communications are a real challenge around this. So I will save the question for tomorrow then, but I just thought, in deference to your constituent that raised the issue, it's one that we need to talk about. So thank you for that.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing with climate resiliency. When you're building in climate resiliency, it's more than just sometimes environmental policy. It's how you respond to things, how we communicate with residents, because it isn't as easy as it was. I mean, as crazy as that sounds, it isn't as easy as it was in 1998. 1998, you had wall-to-wall radio coverage. People had portable radios in their home. People had landlines. I have a cell signal booster in my house. Once my power goes out, my cell signal goes out. I can't do much with my phone, and I don't have a landline anymore. So it's incredible, some of the changes that we have versus when we all in the rural area lost power for over a week, and more for many back in 1998. So there's no question there's a relevance there to speaking of climate resiliency and adaptation. But I do think the right time will be at council. But
that's fine. I can raise it tomorrow. That's no problem at all.
Okay. Thanks, Keith. Councillor King.
Thank you, Chair. And I really would like to thank Councillor Eagle for his line of questioning, though it will be addressed at council tomorrow. But I fully agree. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I had moved a motion primarily dealing with hydro, but ensuring that there's improvement in terms of crisis communication. Of course, we appreciate all the efforts of hydro in terms of, in effect, rebuilding the grid in a very short period of time, and they did yeoman's work. But I think it is important for us to explore the possibilities for improved communications, especially amongst different city partners. Hydro-Waterway being a very important one, since we are the majority shareholder. So I also look forward to asking some of those questions at council tomorrow. But my question is really to staff, and we had a bit of the discussion about this in terms of climate resiliency, working on a strategy, but then at the end of the day, ensuring that really boils down into the development of standard operating procedures to ensure that we have a set of step-by-step instructions for the organization, the city, really to move forward in terms of emergency response. And I wanted to really ask staff, how they're going to go about those considerations once the strategy is created. I say this because we were listening to different deputations from before talking about the impact on residents. Well, in that last storm just a few weeks back, I saw real impacts in terms of resident impacts, especially the potential for human needs issues being resolved in real time and relatively quickly. And it didn't seem apparent that we had standard operating procedures at the beginning of the crisis to really start to address these issues. And we also heard from the previous deputy as well that previous deputations that we need to move relatively quickly, because obviously this is emergency response. So I just wanted to ask the question: how will the strategy be whittled down, and how will it evolve into a standard operating procedures around these types of incidents, which we can only expect will increase in the future due to the challenges of climate change.
Thank you, Chair. I don't mind fielding this one. Thank you for the good question, Councillor King. I think the easiest way to answer this is to say that every emergency has its different set of circumstances that we have to deal with, and it's very, very difficult to create, SOPs or standard guidelines for dealing with everything. And that's what the emergency management program is about, is having plans for major events. And we keep learning and doing after action reports after every major event, so that if we encounter them again in the future, we'll be better prepared. So I agree that it'd be nice to have a very comprehensive plan for absolutely everything. And that would be the goal in the future with regards to climate resiliency, and then how do we address these main concerns, and then let's put a plan in place to ensure that they're addressed. So we'll also be discussing this in the next term of council with regards to public safety and a response to these types of events that seem to be coming back up. So excellent point, making notes, and obviously we'll be addressing that in the future as well.
I appreciate that. I know every event is unique, and I really do want to recognize the incredible response of our first responders, as well as other city staff in terms of the previous event that we had just a few weeks back, a major natural disaster, in my estimation, that impacted many wards across the city. But of course, I would encourage more discussion with other partners, such as the Red Cross. I know that in terms of their responsiveness, they do have standard operating procedures. And I think while it is important for councillors who are on the ground during these situations to obviously have input, we need to ensure that there's a balance in terms of the lead. And obviously, we want the city staff, the permanent staff, to really lead, especially around human needs issues in specific wards when there are emergencies like this. So I look forward to having continuing conversations. I think that this is an excellent report that's before us, and it's very timely based on the challenges that the city continues to have. So thank you for your answer, and thank you for the opportunity to ask the question, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor King. Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks to staff for the report. I'm just hoping staff can elaborate on the highest risk categories that we're seeing. I know you've actually done a great Appendix D here, and I encourage all council members to look at that if you haven't had a chance. It's a second document, and goes through a lot of the risks here. It's a large document, but it outlines them. So just in terms of what are the largest risks facing the city of Ottawa as a result of this report?
Thank you, Councillor. So the challenge with any exercise like this is to distill it down in a couple of short bullets of what our top risks are. I think what the exercise has shown is that climate change is going to affect all elements of our community, all elements of city services. We do have 40 of the priority risks, and they relate to all of the climate hazards: extreme heat, changing seasons, precipitation, global events, as well as the supply chain disruptions that we'll see from global climate change. If I were to highlight just a couple, I would say that extreme heat, and we've heard delegations speak to this already, the health impacts around extreme heat, the carry-on effects of what that means for city services, but also within our community, will be a key challenge. Clearly, the risks to our critical city services, our water and our wastewater services, is top of mind. And that is why, while this work is being done, has been completed, we've been undertaking very specific assessments of those critical water and wastewater treatment plants to make sure that we are identifying solutions now to make sure those services are continuing to be provided. And then I would say the other clear one clearly is about our emergency response to extreme events. And as has already been discussed, the city really works very closely with many partners in emergency preparedness and response, but we know that more needs to be done just because of the frequency and the severity of the risks. The final point I'll make, and I think this was spoken to very eloquently by the delegations, is that this is not just a city issue, this is clearly a community issue as well. And so moving forward, as we're developing the strategy, we really need to work hand in hand with different partners, businesses, institutions, organizations, and communities themselves, both to raise awareness around what these risks are and to identify collectively what can be done.
Thank you for that. I'm glad you mentioned the community side risk, because when you go through the risks that are outlined in that document, and many times you're seeing the community risk at a higher vulnerability, a higher level than the city side risk. Not always, but for most of them, you're seeing that. So I guess the follow-up question to that is what action is the city able to undertake with the funding it currently has to address the, I guess, community, to mitigate the risks that we're seeing in the community specifically, and adaptation within the community specifically.
So this phase of the program really is identifying what those top risks are. And the next phase of the program will be on identifying the strategies and the actions to mitigate those risks. And that will include the community risks. So the early action funding that we've spoken to, if we're looking at addressing, for example, what I spoke to about critical services, although that's a city service, making sure that those adaptation measures are in place, of course, protects our community as well. As we move forward and are developing the strategy we are looking to make sure that we do that community level engagement to identify what those local adaptation plans could look like, and importantly, identify who has the capacity to be able to support and lead the implementation of those to protect the community as well.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, there is no greater threat to Ottawa than to our children than this topic. It is the most important thing we could do to pass on to next generations their quality of life. So I think what I'm hearing is that we need more funding in the near future. We've identified those high risks and there's some funding to start there, but in the future, we're asking to come back later on. And it sounds like we don't have that plan in place, of course, at this time. And that there's a lot more funding needed. I guess the last question just on that piece is, would more allocation to resources do two things: help us save money by lowering our emissions for higher cost items, and number two, would it help us with other orders of government? Are we leaving money on the table with other orders of government in terms of a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, which we know we need the other orders to help us on this. So on those two items of funding specifically, I would love more information on the report.
Thank you, Councillor. I think you raise an excellent point around the need to leverage funding whenever possible. And again, the staff are already doing this. So in last year alone, we submitted $30 million in funding proposals to higher levels of government in order to be able to accelerate key risks that have been identified. So this includes, for example, work to accelerate the power backup, the resiliency at the wastewater treatment plant. It also includes concrete proposals to protect some of our roads that are subject to flooding, including the access point to the Britannia water treatment plant, as well as other erosion protection works to protect our parks and other services. So on one of your points, I think continuing to look for and leverage external funding sources will be key. And we will be continuing to do that as we have the subsequent funding applications are called by the government and working closely with our capital plan partners. The other angle I would say on that is working closely with other agencies to leverage resources, for example, with PSPC, with NCC, with City of Gatineau. So NCC will be releasing their climate vulnerability and risk assessment in 2 days to their board. City of Gatineau has released theirs last year. And so we continue to collaborate with those agencies as well as with other organizations to identify where we can pool our resources and work together. The next item on the agenda deals with the proposed spending plan for the Hydro-Waterway dividend surplus, and that includes a proposal for funding in order to accelerate, again, other studies and capital plan projects to address some of the highest risks that we have.
Thank you for that. I really do appreciate your work on this. It helps, provide us a snapshot going forward. But I remain concerned about the lack of funding coming in that can then leverage more funding from the federal government. I did see the report where it shows that you did put in applications for close to $30 million, and that our climate change master plan better positions us to apply for these sorts of funds. So good we have that in place. It is a very good plan, but I remain concerned about a steady level of funding, whether it's from other departments or within our own area here for that climate change team, because this should be the highest priority in the city. There's nothing more important than this for our kids. And I'm worried we're falling behind, especially on the community side. I think the city side, we're going to be okay. It's the community side I'm really, really worried about here in our city. So thank you for all the work and effort to put in, and it just highlights how much more we need to do.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Chair. And similar to previous comments, I too want to acknowledge staff's work. We've made some progress this term of council. When you look at maybe the stalled work that had happened prior to this term, we're finally seeing some progress here. And although not everyone believes we're moving fast enough, we're moving in the right direction. So I just want to acknowledge that. If I go back a month ago to the derecho, the benefit, if I can call it a benefit, of that time of year was that we were in spring. We weren't in the midsummer where it's uncomfortably hot, and not in midwinter where it's uncomfortably cold. And one of my great fears, Chair, is ice storms and freezing rain. Where Ottawa is located geographically, we're going to get more freezing rain in the future as climate warms up and our winters warm up. I'm very concerned about major ice storms that knock out power, that knock out infrastructure, and how people will be able to function in their homes when a few days later it hits -30 or 35 in the middle of the winter. We always tell people to plan for 72 hours on your own. This past May, people were without power for 8, 9, 10, 11 days in my ward and wards across the city. And what came out of the tornado experience, where city resources were focused in West Carleton and Trent Arlington, was that other wards that weren't hit as bad, like River Ward and Gloucester Southgate, really didn't have a lot of city resources, if any. They were stretched so thin. So I'm looking forward to the postmortem that the City of Ottawa is going to lead. And we hope that the motion that Councillor King and I have worked on for Hydro gets some traction as well. I do think one of our greatest areas that we need to improve on in the community is getting people prepared, both at home, but also what people can do in the community once a storm hits. How can people band together and safely check in on one another? We have resources in the community that go unused, and there's got to be a way to coordinate a community response when the city can't do it because they're stretched so thin, when the storm has such a large geographic coverage like what we just went through last month. So I do think there's some area of improvement there. My question for staff, Chair, is regarding one of the recommendations on the climate resiliency strategy coming back to us in Q4 of 2023. That's still quite some time away. And I'd like to hear from staff why they need that amount of time before they come back to the committee.
Thank you, Councillor, for the question. I think one of the things that is evident in the report before you is just the complexity of the number of hazards, the number of sectors that are affected, the number of city services that are affected, and in particular, the different ways in which communities will be affected on the ground. And in terms of our ability to bring forward a strategy and an action plan that is meaningful and that actually identifies what should be done to address these risks and what our priorities are, the biggest challenge for us is priority setting. And it is why we went through the detailed vulnerability and risk assessment, to be able to make sure we were stepping back and looking at all of the potential risks and examining existing adaptive capacity to really identify where their gaps are. So the end of 2023 is our estimation of when we can bring forward a strategy and a plan that actually has meaningful action to those 40 risks.
Okay, I'm always keen to, particularly with this subject matter, see things progress a little bit faster than planned, but I appreciate having a better understanding of, as you said, the complexities of what's being worked on. So in that regard, Chair, I will be supporting the recommendation before us. I do acknowledge there's some good work here, and I agree with Councillor Menard when you assess, you know, all the priorities of a council, the threats, the real threats of the changing climate are top of the list for me as well. And the City of Ottawa absolutely has a role to play here in setting out that strategy. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to staff for this entire assessment. I think that you know, when we look at the high risks that are in front of us here today, the priority risks and the hazards you know, attached to them, it's shocking. We all knew we were in trouble, but if this doesn't frighten people, I'm not sure what will. You know, it's almost hard to pick out the one that concerns me the most. I think they're all frightening, and we don't have a lot of time to catch up and get ahead. We're still playing catch up, as many cities are, but we certainly are playing catch up, and we need to do so and get ahead. And I look at I guess for me, often when I think about vulnerability and I think about high risk groups, you know, it does, you know, it's no secret that high risk groups didn't create the situations that we're in today, but they are the ones that will be most greatly impacted, whether that's internationally, whether that's across, you know, geographically across the country, or even just in each of our communities. So I do have concerns that we're not addressing this with any real immediate funding. So I have two questions. My first one is around emergency services and the response to vulnerable, I hate calling them vulnerable groups, but marginalized, people who are marginalized, people who are you know, living in rooming houses, shelters, etc., that spend an inordinate amount of time outdoors in the extreme heat, in the extreme cold, people who have to sleep outside, and people who don't necessarily have access to air conditioning, which is becoming as important as heating in our climate. And just to staff on, you know, we see here that these are risks that are requiring immediate action. And when we have extreme heat today, extreme heat days, you know, we do a bit. We open up some heating, cooling stations, but you know, do we have the funding required to ensure that people at the highest risk of death by heat are adequately served? And more important, do we track as a city people who die from heat-related illnesses?
Thank you, Chair and Councillor. I'll be happy to pass over if Ottawa Public Health is on the line with regards to tracking of people who die from heat illnesses. I can assure you that every one of these disaster type situations quickly escalates us to call in our People Task Force experts to come in and assist. And, it is definitely one of the first things that we think about now when we are faced with these emergencies is how do we help our most vulnerable and those who need help. So from that perspective, yes, it is top of mind. With regards to funding, obviously we need to look at more as part of this strategy and as part of what the city can do in the future. We need to continue to reconsider that from every aspect of things. So great question. I'll pass it over to Dr. Etches if she may have information with regards to the numbers as well as the heat strategy that they've developed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I agree that concern is warranted. I don't think that especially lower income populations without access to cooling do have enough protection through what we see is ahead. So currently what we know we do for data is as we are warning and letting people know there's heat, harmful risks to health from heat coming. We also use monitoring at that time. So we look at emergency room visits. We look at, with paramedics, we have qualitative information about what's happening, what are they seeing, but we quantitatively look at emerge. We haven't, in past events, seen really significant rises in emergency room visits to heat, but we can detect some rise. And so that's something we watch. For the deaths, it takes a little bit longer to get information about cause of death, but this is something we look at. We can look at year over year to see patterns and trends, not just in the moment. For information in the moment about death, the coroners really have the latest as they investigate and they see what's happening on the ground. So we're also in touch with them. All to say, death is the worst outcome, and of course, we want to prevent people getting to that point. So, our plans right now are including working with a whole network of providers that can connect with populations at greater risk. So on the ground through multiple agencies, we let people know when we're concerned about health impacts from heat, and people are able to do more outreach. I think we know that this is something that really, in the end, we really need to build the capacity of all community members to look after each other too, and understand what the signs are of danger for heat-related illness. We are promoting, we have these campaigns, every year we'll continue to promote the Beat the Heat tips about how to stay cool, even if you don't have air conditioning. So this Beat the Heat messaging, will continue to amplify, and that's what can actually concretely also help, if people don't have fans, getting people fans, helping them understand how to shower or cool or use mist to cool down. We work with partners on cooling centers, but I think there's some thoughts around how useful those are and what, not necessarily really the solution. So we have a plan that's related to heat and cold and smog that does focus on the populations at greatest risk. Absolutely. We've been mapping where people are likely to be at greatest risk. So these are the foundational activities. I think where we need to go further is recognizing the risk is only growing. So the monitoring in time and over time will be one of the roles that public health plays and continues to play. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think that, and I appreciate everything that public health does, emergency services, in terms of addressing it and tracking where the highest risks are. But I really would at some point like to see, us reporting out on deaths from heat-related illness. I think that, it's easy to forget how high risk some populations are, some people are, not populations, they're people, you know, and they're not even vulnerable. They're very resilient. People living in rooming houses and shelters actually are, I'm probably more vulnerable than they are if we're all left to our own devices. They're marginalized, but you know, they are resilient. I don't know how people do it, but they do. But I do, and I think, you know, even simple things like, you know, I've spoken to emergency response about this, our emergency preparedness. You know, just simple things like misting stations from our fire hydrants, you know, around the downtown or areas where you have higher populations of people living, you know, without air and at higher risk. Just set up a little misting station coming out of a fire hydrant. It's fun. First off, people like it. I've been in cities where they have them. It's good for, you know, people visiting. It's good for people shopping, etc. People just like it, but it also gives somebody who may not otherwise have a place to cool off, cool off. And just one more question to staff. I had brought a motion, I think it was seconded by Chair Moffat, back through our budget process. It was deferred to the long-range financial plan around transit when we to pull 11 million out of our gas tax, the additional gas tax that we got for 2021. And I just to ask staff on the 11 million, have you been working, like have those the staff in Treasury in the Treasurer's office, have they reached out to you to understand how that $11 million might be used to address some of these priority risks that you know, we're looking at 1 to 3 years, so perhaps we need more than the 11 million, but certainly that is that would be a start.
Yeah, through the chair. So good question, Councillor. I know Isabel Jasmine, my colleague, has been kind of the lead on this component of the file. I did connect with her late last week, but she's still waiting here on some outstanding questions, I guess. But I'll definitely take that offline and commit to getting back to you this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest for sure, if that works.
Okay, thank you, Cyril. I appreciate that. I just think that now's the time to be, you know, having that conversation between the two departments. So I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Eglack.
Thanks. I don't usually go on twice, but a number of themes popped up during the questions. Just wanted to try to pull them together a little bit. Next term of council, you're coming back with a costing of the plan. And I'm just wondering if you could share a bit more information about how that costing is going to be handled. And what I mean by that is you set out a number of priorities. As you start to do the costing, do you anticipate that you will be going in and moving some of those priorities around, and sort of working towards a fixed target of dollars, or is the purpose of your costing to cost everything? Just bring the whole enchilada to council and have council figure out how much money they can find at the time and what they believe of those projects should get the funding. So I guess what I'm saying is, are you going to present a targeted funding plan, or are you just going to give the whole thing to council and say, this is going to cost X millions of dollars, and these are the things, you know, that we think need to be done? Or will you take a position where you'll be a bit more directed, saying we think it's reasonable that this many dollars can be raised either through city resources or other levels of government, and keeping that in mind, these are the things we think should be done out of the list that we presented to you last term of council?
Thank you. I'll start off, and if others on the call would like to jump in, please feel free to do so. I think the specifics on the costing, we're still working that out, the level of detail, the best approach to do it. I think we need all of it. We need to understand what specific the costs are for very specific projects, and clearly those will be related to the priority risks that have been identified. But there are some of the solutions are going to be long-term solutions in changing how we either build and design and build, or we maintain and operate. I'm speaking just of the city services right now, but there will be similar on the community side. And I think those kinds of costings and understanding how we approach that need to get embedded in all city work plans and budgets, and inevitably in the long-range financial plans for all of the city services. So I think in the next year and a half, we need to be focusing on what makes most sense from a cost-benefit analysis and from a costing of specific initiatives. And we will bring forward that analysis when we come forward at the end of next year. But I would anticipate that full costings are going to get reflected in many other parts of departmental work plans and in the long-range plans.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I may, Chair, I'll probably just add on to that, just given the finance nature, but as you can see today, it's very complex, and there is funding across every service delivery, whether it's operating, service delivery, and capital. So that's why it's important that, the finance team is working closely with the climate change team, working closely with the asset management team, and working closely with all the operational teams. So it will be a significant feat, but we're here together to work together to do that work, and that's why we need that time to kind of do that deep dive, but extensive deep dive as well, to come back with that costing information that's needed.
Thanks, Cyril. Thank you, Councillor Eglak. Any other questions for staff or any comments on the file in front of us? Seeing none.
Well, just Chair, on when will we know about that 11 million again? Is it when it comes, is it sooner than the next week or two, or Cyril? I'm surprised we don't know already if it's coming very soon.
Yeah, through Chair. So Councillor, I just need to circle back with Isabel. She may have the information, but we haven't closed the loop between. It's her file, not my file. So I just want to close the loop with her, and I'll follow up this afternoon.
Okay, and is it coming to committee at some point soon, or is it, you're not aware of that detail either?
Yeah, I'll follow up with that information.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, the motion was that the referral was that the motion be referred to staff to be analyzed in turn, staff report back to council in Q2 2022 in the context of the long range financial plan transit. And that referral carried on a division of 14 to 10. Okay, so back to my agenda, on the report in front of us, that the Standing Committee on Environment Protection, Water and Waste Management recommend that Council 1 receive the climate vulnerability and risk assessment attached as documents 1 and 2 and summarize this report. 2, direct staff to bring forward the climate resiliency strategy by Q4 2023. 3, direct staff to consider resourcing needs to develop the climate resiliency strategy as part of the 2023 budget process, including resources to support public and stakeholder engagement. 4, direct staff leading new or updates to city plan strategies, policies, and programs to take the CVRA findings into consideration. 5, direct staff to consider resourcing needs to further assess or mitigate known climate risks as part of the 2023 budget process to accelerate early action while the climate resiliency strategy is being developed. 6, direct staff to consider climate resiliency in the 2023-2026 strategic plan / term of council priorities. On that report. Carried. Thank you. So we move on to item 2, which is about accelerating early action while the climate resiliency strategy is being developed. The 2021 Hydro-Ottawa dividend surplus spending plan. So the update on Hydro-Ottawa, their AGM is tomorrow. So they'll be reporting on this to council. We know now from their report that the dividend is $23.7 million, which means that the dividend surplus is $3.7 million. And we have a report in front of us and a presentation from staff on the dividend surplus spending plan.
And Chair, if I could interrupt, there is a technical amendment.
Technical amendment, yes. Who has that amendment, Chris? Sean has it, so go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chris, I have it in my email. Do you want me to just?
That's on the screen.
Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay. I guess I should read the whereases. We're on page 4 of the report. Hydro-Waterway dividend surplus spending plan. The bullet point references energy management at the drinking water purification plants. And whereas the original text, as noted, is specific to drinking water plants, Britannia and Lemieux, and whereas alternative wording allows for the inclusion of all drinking water and wastewater facilities across the city of Ottawa, as intended by the report, therefore be it resolved that with respect to the bullet point on page 4 of the report, item 2 to 2021 Hydro-Ottawa dividend surplus spending plan referencing energy management at the drinking water purification plants be deleted in its entirety and be replaced with the following: energy management at water facilities.
All right, thank you. Okay, so to staff for their presentation. Andrea Flowers. I had that to put the last name because we had Andrea Gay Farley earlier, and I don't want to confuse everyone. There's so many Andreas.
Thank you, Chair. Chris, if you'd like to bring up the presentation.
You're on mute there, Andrea, so I'm not sure. You've probably been talking for a little while, but I could only tell in the tiny box above me, that above the screen, that you were talking on mute.
Okay.
There you go.
We might have a bit of feedback now that we've switched. Do you hear the feedback?
I don't.
Great. Well, we'll just ignore that and carry on. So as been mentioned today, the Hydro-Waterway dividend surplus has been part of the funding strategy in order to advance climate change objectives in Ottawa. In March 2019, Council directed that any surplus in the Hydro-Waterway dividend received in this term of Council be directed towards energy efficiency, conservation, or renewable energy programs with Ottawa. And as part of that direction, specific projects were to be recommended by staff and approved by this committee once the specific dollar amount, if any, was known. The report that you received today was written before the amount of the Hydro-Waterway dividend was known. And so in its entirety, the report proposes a prioritized $5 million spending plan with projects to be considered in order of priority from top to bottom. And as you've mentioned, Chair, Council will receive that Hydro-Waterway annual report tomorrow. Next slide, please. The spending plan included in the report supports greenhouse gas reductions, builds resiliency, and intends to leverage provincial or federal funds where possible, and supports the implementation of the climate change master plan priorities, including energy evolution, climate resiliency, and private action projects. The projects under this proposed spending plan include a mix of municipal, residential, and commercial energy conservation or efficiency projects, as well as municipal and public EV charging infrastructure. It also helps advance some of the work related to renewable energy generation, including solar panels on municipal facilities. And it supports the communication, education, and engagement aspects that we've heard both from Councillor this morning as well as delegations. We have also recommended that some of that funding be used to advance early actions identified in the climate vulnerability and risk assessment. And these are really to support the ongoing development of the climate resiliency strategy. If you go to the next slide, Chris, one more slide that just describes where some of the surplus could be used to support staff working on these initiatives. We have proposed both extending to existing temporary staff to support communications and outreach, as well as EVs. And the full spending plan would fund up to 4 new staff to support more work in the commercial building retrofit space, as well as integrating climate change and asset management and capital planning, energy management in the water plants, as was just changed by the technical amendment, and support ongoing development of a distributed energy generation framework. And happy to respond to any questions that committee may have on this proposed spending plan.
Thank you, Andrea. We actually have delegations first to get to, and then we'll go to questions to staff. So our first delegation on this item is Barbara Ramsey, who's the acting chair of cafes.
Just a
Try
moment, Chair.
unmuting myself. We got a warm up going there, and
there we go.
Video. There we go. We're rolling now. So good to see you, Chair Moffat and Vice Chair Menard, councillors and staff, both Julia and Adam. I really appreciated your presentations. So I'm grateful to have a few minutes with you today, twice I hope actually. But this appearance is really intended to broaden the discussion and perhaps raise the backdrop on an elephant in the room as you approach the dispensing of the annual and only climate windfall, the Ottawa Hydro dividend. Next slide. Chris, if I could. I'm speaking now, as you mentioned, the recently elected acting chair of Cafes, an organization I think you know well. And after all of today's many speakers, many related to the work of Cafes, you must be thinking, where in the world is Angela Keller-Herzog? As she is truly the central piece to Cafes, its advocacy, so much of its effort, and probably its face, truly. Next slide, Chris. Well, as you've heard earlier, Angela is enjoying her role as a mother today and is celebrating her son as he graduates at Queen's and moves on to a master's in engineering. She and her family deserve that pleasure, but it leaves you with me to deliver some recommendations on climate finance on behalf of Cafes. Next slide, please. This slide overviews the status quo on how we fund climate management in Ottawa today. Your council had the temerity to make climate a priority and called a climate emergency early in your term. 3 years later, the city has no long-range financial plan to address mitigation and adaptation to deal with the emergency. This is an opportunity. As the chair alluded to earlier this morning, the city's operating budget does not address the climate issue head-on, despite declaring the crisis. There is no line item to address energy evolution, the city's energy transition strategy, and so it leaves your staff and the full council where you are today, planning to divvy up a hydro dividend because a significant plan to justify more has never been funded. In effect, it leaves you choosing from a laundry list of items to cobble together, rather than delivering a cohesive response to achieve climate resiliency in a timeline you would prefer. It's kind of like humming the tunes you can't wait to hear at Blues or Jazz Fest or City Folk this summer, but you didn't bother to go out and buy a ticket. The elephant in the room is why. Those with an organizational management background suggested is the absence of resourcing, human resourcing, focused strategic planning and analysis suborned by a lack of dedicated staff or resources. Next slide, please, Christopher. Cafes would like to suggest the answer is to build up and out capacity at City Hall. The climate unit is currently buried within a very busy planning department. To deliver and enhance a municipal energy transition strategy, it needs a dedicated senior manager lead to provide issue promotion, to guide the business of strategic planning, and dedicated professional financial staff. Next slide. We want to be clear. Cafes fully supports the content pieces of the current spending plan directed towards the implementation of energy evolution. as well as the critical aspect of improved public engagement. After all, 95% of the problem is in the community. But are we creating solutions in Ottawa leveraging current and planned resources? In other words, are we managing a plan? Slide 7. So Cafes asks you to question, why is there no spending plan to accelerate current allocations? We think specifically on the mitigation side and trees and green nature and urgent action areas such as organics out of landfill. And to our point above, where are the FTEs to look more comprehensively and strategically at the financial plan necessary to address the emergency? And in slide 8, our next slide, Christopher, here are recommendations. We've lifted the elephant's foot, so to speak, and Cafes recommends Ottawa needs a climate czar who will champion specific governance and advocate and amplify this issue in all forums, including the community. Dedicate the senior management position to give home to and develop and accelerate a complete program to address the huge issue of climate management in the shorter timeline we need. How? Cause to have developed and define a long-range climate financial plan that goes beyond 2026. Provide appropriate climate risk disclosure to standards. Champion the development, encourage resource and identification and leverage programs with the feds, the province, government, and others. Julia spoke to this earlier. The staff need to work on acceleration as an example, but to do that, they need a louder echo. To take first steps, to dedicate staff and specifically climate finance FTEs to develop and deliver a sustainable strategic plan. Last slide. Thanks to you for your efforts over your last term of council, this term of council, and Scott, perhaps your last term of council, and for your time and attention to the presentations today. And on behalf of Cafes, thank you for always being a welcoming voice.
Thanks, Barbara. You said perhaps my last term of council. Maybe you know something I don't. Councillor Menard.
No, but Ottawa is nothing but scuttlebutt, Scott. You know that.
Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Barbara. A great presentation.
Thank you, Sean.
I do wonder about when we compare to other cities, and I don't know if you've done any of that work in terms of our climate staff, because a lot of our staff are temporary, and they're not FTEs that are permanent, as you said in your presentation. And that's really one of the ways cities work towards mitigating climate, is having the resources, the people to be able to work on the issue. So have you looked at any other cities in the vicinity and what their FTEs are or climate funding plans are?
Well, I specifically have not, Sean. As I said, I've been working with Cafes primarily as its treasurer and working on governance and enhancement, and I've recently stepped in as chair. And the person who has those answers, of course, is Angela. But I do know that there are examples, and I have heard them defined and spoken of, but to pull them up right now for you. But on one aspect of it, I speak specifically and can reiterate is the issue of standards. And there are risk standard tools and assessments. And my understanding is that in some cases, we're not testing ourselves against those standards. And in other cases, we're not meeting the standards that exist in other Canadian cities. So the answer to your question is, I know that information is out there. I know it's accessible. And with your permission, I'll have Angela, when she gets back from Kingston, send something to you.
That's okay. Let me ask this in a different way. Would it surprise you to learn that Gatineau, the city next door to us, obviously a much smaller city, is hiring 56 staff and investing over 100 million, 106 million over the next 5 years for climate work?
Well, that doesn't surprise me, but what we would like to hear is that lengthened window and that commitment. And I think where it's hard to commit that investment at an organizational level, my background is business management, not government management, but nonetheless, it's very hard to commit that degree of investment if you don't have a plan and if you don't have a methodology to drive the investment. And I don't mean that in a negative way when it goes to staff. You've got a complement of staff here clearly that are grappling with the issues. From the outside, it looks like they're grappling with a lack of resources. And when it comes to climate change, one of the more complex aspects of it, I understand, is in fact the management of the financial complexities, the leveraging, the payoffs, the paybacks, and including that in a complete financial picture that helps those who are trying to justify the kind of investment that folks like you want to make. Are we really getting payback? If you don't have the minds analyzing that, Councillor Menard, you don't win the advocacy component. So yeah, I hear you. I get why even a smaller city like Gatineau wants to invest like that. I don't think Ottawa is without a want. I just think the linchpin at the core of it has to be identified. And from our perspective, and this organizational manager's perspective, you need a linchpin at the top in your very strong senior leadership team to drive this issue. I heard you talk quickly about stovepiping earlier this morning, and that's part of the problem. They know they've got to pull these investments, pardon the background, pull the investments out of these various silos and concentrate them, reconfigure them, and then leverage them. But that's not new. I know you've heard that talk before.
Certainly. Yeah, no, thank you. That's why one of the reasons Councillor McKenney's motion was so important about that climate funding, because it was federal gas tax funds. It wasn't a new tax increase. It was federal gas tax funds that could be used then as a revolving fund to leverage more savings, which city staff have done the work on. They've seen the payback of, so to your point about, the payback piece and how you create that plan. Well, very confident in city staff's ability and what they've looked at with other municipalities for that revolving fund, where you can make investments in things like your transportation and your building systems and community-based investments and have a return. This is being done in many cities in Ontario. So I really appreciate your comments here today. Very, very important comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Barbara, for your time.
Thank you, Chair.
Our next speaker is Charles Nixon.
Greetings. I can be on video too. Sorry, 1 second. There we go.
Morning,
Good afternoon. Sorry. Thank you, Chair, for this opportunity. My name is Charles Nixon. I am part of a group called Citizen Climate Council, who do free work to try and support the direction of the city on climate change. A short piece was provided to you in advance, and I would like to make some short remarks based on it. In 2019, the city set an ambitious course to reach net zero by 2050, and more recently tabled the beginnings of an resiliency strategy, which is good news, but requires more work to be finalized. The sooner the better, given our changing climate. Spending in an organized way to prevent major damage to the city and its infrastructure is in fact cheaper than cleaning up after the fact. Pay now or pay more later is the catchword on that. So people's instincts are right. How is the city doing against their climate change plans? It's difficult to follow based on public reporting at this committee and elsewhere. As well, whether the projects being tackled are in the right order to help create dividends for future work is also unclear. There is no carbon budget to help frame this large and important undertaking for the city, nor is there a capacity to provide the necessary overall leadership to be successful, and we clearly want it to succeed. Today, we focus on a funding source for elements this committee oversees derived from the Hydro-Waterway dividend spending plan, which was 2.5 million in 2020 and 800,000 in 2021. We support the ask for $5 million for 2022. Any less would further set back plans already late. We do wonder, and I guess I'm hearing some of this about the gas tax and how that might be used and how is that administered and how does that fit into what this committee sees. At the same time, there was a surplus from the year before, $50 million. And how does that play in to, so that is the only funding source the Hydro-Waterway dividend? I think not. In future, with a new council, we sincerely hope that more transparent and timely funding will be available and on a multi-year basis. The city runs on about 4.7 billion of operating and capital budget, which should be in any play, which should also be in play to some extent to drive the necessary change. Any large undertaking like this in any organization would need to look inside to ensure the funding is going to the right place at the right time for the right priorities in order to succeed. Once again, we support the ask for 5 million and sincerely hope those funds will be used to help set the stage for our climate change management and to lead us to better manage this under a new council after the election. Thanks very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Charles. And just for committee members, you'll notice there's correspondence here from Judith Kennedy. That's the correspondence that Charles is referring to that we received earlier from the Citizen Climate Council. Any questions for Charles? Seeing none, thank you for your...
If I may, you asked questions to the previous person. Yes, you do need somebody who's in charge, but the work needs to be integrated into every lead department, and you should have written performance agreements for all senior managers to ensure that you're driving the change across all parts of the government, of the city government. You can't do it any other way. Otherwise, and nothing can be sacrosanct. That's the other thing. The city has a tremendous challenge before it, and which is very exciting, but it requires, strong leadership.
All right.
A small point about.
Thanks. Well, I just wanted, I understand that the other delegation had questions asked to them.
Yep.
Not every delegation gets questions asked. Everyone gets 5 minutes to speak.
Oh, I understand.
So I appreciate, like I said, I appreciate your comments. We have your correspondence.
Yep. Thank you,
Judith. So appreciate that. Thank you. So questions to staff? Any questions for Andrew Flowers or her team on the report in front of us and the proposal to spend the dividend surplus, which we now again know is 4.5 times what it was last year, thankfully. Councilor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yeah, it's nice to see it to be that level. Obviously, we were hoping for some funds from the federal government to cover off our federal province, I think, to cover off the storm costs that occurred. And this is, of course, last year's, where the storm and what future capital expenses may have for Hydro-Waterway, I think is yet to be seen. So that's going to be a big, major piece. And I think goes to the point of this funding is really not as secure as you'd like it. It changes every year, and it's not secure. So just to the point of our FTEs that we have now, if there's climate change staff on the line, how many FTEs do we have working in the group, and how many are permanent on the climate change team?
Thank you, Councillor. There are currently 14 staff in the Climate Change and Resiliency Unit. 6 of those are permanent and 8 of those are temporary. There is also a staff who is seconded 50% from Ottawa Public Health. So they split their time, and that's a permanent position.
Okay, thank you. I had asked a question previously about leveraging other funding from the province and the federal government. Yeah, I know we've applied for programs. Can you just say more about that in terms of financing? Do we often have to put in a third when we're applying for these programs? Are they more loan-based applications? Just if you could just give me a bit more information about what we're applying for and how we leverage more funds. And if we had more funding, could we then leverage more funds? Are we leaving money on the table?
Thank you, Councillor. In terms of funding, it comes in a wide variety of models. There are some that are 80% contributions by the feds, 20% by the city, and that's one we're chasing for green and inclusive community buildings, so for retrofits. That's one of the best. Many of them are 50-50, so we put in 50% of the cost, someone else puts in another 50. Some are less than that. We're currently pursuing funding related to EV charging infrastructure, which is certainly less than that. We have pursued funding related to grants and studies, and the model changes for that as well. So it's really all over the board. Most of our funding applications are directed to the federal government, and we know that they have both had challenges in getting funding out the door, and in many cases they've been oversubscribed. So there's challenges associated with the funding that flows from those senior levels of government as well. We have secured the largest single funding application was, of course, for the Better Homes Loan Program. And that was a $4 million grant and an $8 million loan. So it's one where there's a lot more of a loan capacity within that. And of course, we're pursuing funding through the Canada Infrastructure Bank to support some of the work on the e-buses. So very wide range, both in terms of the funding amounts we're seeking on the mitigation side and on the funding types available or the streams that the federal government in particular has identified.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to pick up on what the delegations had mentioned. And it was around, really driving sort of the plan for where investments could go, how you see a payback on that, and of course, meeting our objectives in the climate change master plan. The biggest concern for me is on the community side. I think 95% of our emissions are on the community side, whereas 5% are on the city side. So if there was more available resources, what would it be used for in your recommendation on the community side, where most of our emissions are coming from, where most of our plan needs to evolve? And granted, I understand the climate change team hasn't been in a position to say, well, we've got 50 million like Gatineau has. Here's exactly where it's going to go. But in your estimation, on the community side, what would be the greatest value for us as a city, given the plan that we've got in place now?
It is a challenging question to answer. Of course, that you can see in the Hydro-Waterway dividend surplus that we've tried to target areas that have significant GHG reductions associated as modeled in energy evolution. And of course, many of those projects are scalable. So even where we've identified a number, it's to continue advancing the work. It's to continue learning lessons so that we can continue to do better. And much of that is scalable. Certainly, I think we know that on the building retrofit side, there will be significant forms of capital infusion required, either to catalyze these types of reductions or to even raise awareness on the opportunities for individual organizations, businesses, and individuals to capitalize on themselves. So building retrofits will be very difficult, both in the residential and commercial space, and they make up a substantial amount of our emissions. And of course, the switch to electric vehicles is the single largest tranche within our energy emissions model, representing about 20% of emissions out of the, call it 100% reduction. Most of these things are scalable. As we work through this, We know that we're going to hit more substantial barriers, particularly for populations that don't have easy access to this. And we have not done sufficient work, in my opinion, yet to know where the extent of those barriers are. And so some of the funds that we've identified in our Hydro-Waterway dividend spending plan starts to look at some of those more vulnerable populations and how we can start to work more directly with those groups, as one example.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Egley.
Thank you, Chair. Andre, to a previous question, you had indicated that there were 14 staff members, I believe, that were directly engaged with the climate team. I just want to build on a comment that Cyril had made about for the funding model coming forward for the last item, that you know, there were pieces all throughout the city, all different departments, all different programs. And maybe you can't answer this, and if you can't, I understand, but can you give us a sense of how many people in the city are engaged in the climate environment questions that we're dealing with? Because I'm assuming, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I'm assuming it's well beyond the 14 people that you've referred to. So can you give us a sense of what the staff complement is citywide that would be working on these issues?
It's an excellent point, Councillor. Thank you for raising it. Of course, we work with our colleagues across all departments to advance this work. And beyond the work that we are leading in the climate resiliency team, there are key projects which are being advanced, such as the master plans, infrastructure, green space, solid waste, transportation, master plans, and others, which are all moving forward, in addition to the asset management plans and many other pieces. We're fortunate to work with many of those teams as contributors to the plans as they're being developed. They come back to us to understand what some of the climate projections require. For instance, in the infrastructure master plan, they come back to us to make sure that the scenarios that they're looking at the transportation master plan are being compared to what the energy evolution model calls for. They come back to us in a solid waste master plan to understand what our potential for new renewable natural gas might be and how that might fit into the larger complement. I think the key difference is that they're responsible for these files in their entirety, and they're bringing the climate piece in. They're not always directly accountable for the climate change aspects. And so while we work with, I think it's fair to say, well more than 100 staff across the corporation on a variety of aspects for these projects, we've heard from other teams and other managers that they're doing it from the sides of their desks as well, that the climate change is something which is being addressed in addition to all of the other technical, operational, and strategic requirements that they have as they move these other plans forward. So very fair point, and certainly a significant amount of credit and acknowledgement to our colleagues across the corporation who are trying to move their files forward with these climate considerations as part of it.
Thank you. And I wasn't sure you'd have that number at the tip of your fingers. And I just think it's important to, don't want to leave the public with the sense that there's 14 people on a team. There are, and they're doing great work, but that the city's commitment is larger than that. And there are more people working on it. And just to follow up on that, one of the other terms we've heard a number of times this morning is how things are siloed at the city. And you've just shared that your team's working with at least 100 different employees in different departments. So can you comment on how serious you think the silo issue is, and what suggestions you might have that we could help you with in order to break down those silos?
It's a very interesting question, Councillor. Thank you. In terms of silos, it's always a reality in a large organization, and the larger the organization becomes, the more complex and the more wide-ranging the issues are, the bigger the tendency to go down deep into these details. I think in the presentation that we saw before, I see a lot of hope and a lot of commitment that we had 5 general managers here for the climate vulnerability and risk assessment. And I think that's an example where climate change is starting to really appear at that level within the organization in terms of both the spokespeople that are here today to answer questions, whether it's for emergency protective services, Ottawa Public Health, infrastructure, finance, or public works. But with all of those folks on the line and answering these questions, we also know that those questions are happening at the larger senior leadership table. And I think that's a change which we've seen certainly over this term of council, and perhaps accelerated over the last several months. So in terms of silos, I think the easiest way for us to address and reduce the silos is for it to go up the chain, both in terms of priority and discussion, and then financing, budgeting, work plan, and strategic priorities, so that we're moving in one direction.
Thanks for that as well. I think it gives a broader perspective of what the city's doing as a whole. So, so I appreciate those answers. Very helpful.
Thank you, Councillor Eglai. Questions for staff? Seeing none, the report in front of us is that the Standing Committee on Environment Protection, Water and Waste Management recommend Council approve the prioritized spending plan as shown in document 1, with funding for implementation to be aligned with Hydro-Waterway's dividend surplus once the dollar amount, if any, is known. On the item?
Chair, you need to approve the amending motion.
Oh yes,
and
of
the report
course.
as amended.
You keep on reminding me about that, and I just don't even. On the technical amendment?
Carried.
And on the report as amended?
Carried.
Thank you so much. All right. We now move on to item number 6, which is the motion on the endorsement of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This item has, we have 4 delegations on it. It's a motion from Councillor McKenney, so I'll ask them to introduce the item.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I won't read the entire motion. It was introduced at the as noticed at our last meeting, but it does call on us on our committee and to recommend to Council that we endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have, there are over 50 cities globally who have endorsed the treaty, and you'll likely hear from some of our delegates today. A couple more cities have come on, and it's, it does reaffirm our commitment to energy evolution. It's, we could certainly argue that it's symbolic, but there are times when symbolism, especially when it's international, when we make these commitments to our plans to address climate action, our climate crises, especially for calling for non-proliferation treaty on fossil fuels, because we know that fossil fuel exploration, expansion, just really means that we will not, if we don't do something immediate, we will not phase out in time to meet our global commitment to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we've just gone through an entire discussion on the most immediate risks just to our city. And beyond that, we have, other risks that are just over the horizon. So it does call on us to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and ask that, the mayor, on behalf of our council, sends a letter to the Prime Minister and Premier urging both the Canadian and Ontario governments to also support the global initiative for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So I look forward to the discussion, and I look forward to us taking what is an important step in making Ottawa a leader in this movement. Thank you.
Thanks. Just before we get to delegations, if I could just ask Andrea Flowers. Just a quick comment on it, just in terms of how it fits with our climate change master plan, and if it's a large deviation from what we've already committed to as a council.
Thank you, Chair. Really, this treaty is about growing momentum to phase out fossil fuels. And in my opinion, it doesn't change anything we're already doing. It recommits and reinforces our efforts in this direction.
All right. And then I've heard some concern that we could not issue a building permit for a house that's on natural gas or something like that. And my understanding is that we actually don't have the authority to dictate what type of fuel source someone actually uses at this point. Is that accurate?
There are limitations to our authority within Ontario, and the treaty does include a list of suggestions, suggested actions that we could take, but none of them are mandatory. So there are also potentially controversial recommendations. You've mentioned one. No natural gas in new communities or new buildings, no new gas stations, no natural gas advertising, for instance. We have mixed authority on some of these areas, but overall, because these are not mandatory aspects to commit to, I don't see any risk in joining.
Okay. All right, thank you. So we will go to our delegations on this. And our first one you can see now, Cecile Samuel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be connecting with you all, and especially on Indigenous Peoples Day, the National Day of Indigenous Peoples, who are the original custodians of this land and have been fighting and resisting for generations for the rights of their peoples to sovereignty and self-determination, and to those same rights for the earth. So it's really an honor to speak with you today on the importance of urgently leaving behind the destructive fossil fuel era and shifting our energy systems to renewable ones that allow our earth to flourish instead of perish. My name is Cecile Samuel. I'm the Global Cities campaign lead for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, where I campaign and support a growing global coalition of now more than 50 cities around the world that are calling for an end to fossil fuel expansion. Oh, actually, I should have slides for this. Sorry, Chris, can you please put these up if you're there? Thank you. So yeah, now more than 50 cities around the world who are calling for an end to fossil fuel expansion, a fair phase out of oil, gas, and coal, and a just energy transition for all. I'm Ethiopian Canadian, and I was born in Montreal. And as a little kid, I moved to Ottawa, where I attended Devonshire Public School, Fisher Park, and Glebe High School. So this moment today is also really important for me on a personal level as well. So there are three substances that jeopardize life on Earth in an unequivocal and fundamental way and put the very question of planetary life in peril. And these are oil, gas, and coal, because fossil fuels are responsible in the past decade for 86% of carbon emissions released and around 75% of all carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution. And this trend is not relenting. The world is currently on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels by the end of this decade than what is compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the majority of this expansion, 85%, is planned in two countries, Canada and the US. Next slide, please. It's not enough to only stop the expansion that hurtles our planet towards climate collapse. We must begin phasing out oil, gas, and coal, as existing projects alone make the 1.5 degree target impossible to reach. Next slide, please. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty calls for three things. The first is non-proliferation, so to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Then a fair phase out of existing fossil fuel reserves of coal, oil, and gas, and a just energy transition to ensure renewable energy access for all. Next slide, please. This is needed to complement the Paris Agreement, which focuses on tackling greenhouse gas emissions and demand, but remains silent on fossil fuels and currently leads us to a massive overshoot of our climate targets. And so we see the Fossil Fuel Treaty as a complementary mechanism to ensure international cooperation for an equitable transition off fossil fuels that has been supported by 101 Nobel laureates, thousands of academics and scientists, youth activists and civil society organizations, hundreds of parliamentarians and faith leaders, and as you've heard, at more than 50 cities around the world. So in Canada, emissions from oil and gas production are the largest and fastest growing source of emissions, and the primary reason that it can't meet its Paris commitments. And in the International Energy Agency's latest policy review of Canada's energy system, released in January, the IEA correctly identifies fossil fuel production as a barrier to achieving the country's climate targets. And while research shows that globally, every dollar of renewable energy investment generates 2 to 5 times more jobs than the equivalent investment in fossil fuels, Canada, the US, and Australia give some of the largest subsidies for fossil fuels per capita. Next slide, please. With these dangerous trends from national governments around the world, the role of cities is vital in building pressure from below to create systemic change. And we've seen this with historic precedent, just as nuclear-free cities played a critical role in calling for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. City councils around the world can help build momentum towards a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Cities are on the front line of the climate crisis. They're facing wildfires, flooding, storms, heat waves. We've seen freak weather events in Ottawa alone in the past weeks that have stolen lives and put out the lights in thousands of homes, and wildfires across British Columbia that have erased entire towns. So to stop this devastation, we need to stop the source, which is oil, gas, and coal. Next slide, please. Vancouver became the first city in the world to endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and many other Canadian cities have followed suit, such as Toronto, Montreal, and Victoria. And these are joined by global cities across the world. Next slide, please, including Paris, Sydney, LA, Barcelona, Amsterdam, Canberra, and Geneva, among countless others. Next slide, please. All recognizing the importance of making the fossil fuel era history and shifting to renewable energy systems for all. And last slide. Ottawa plays a significant role as the nation's capital and has already indicated the need to phase out fossil fuels and increase the use of renewable energy as part of the city's community energy transition strategy. And so I invite you to support Ottawa to rise as a climate leader and join their fellow Canadian and global cities in endorsing the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Samuel. We have a question here from Councillor McKenney.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thanks, Sybil, for coming out. That was a great presentation. I just want to pick up on a good point that that the Chair made with staff. A lot of what is in the treaty doesn't pertain necessarily to the municipal realm. It's part of the Municipal Act, so it can be provincial, it can be federal responsibility, but the last be it further resolve that's in the motion that I'm bringing today is that that we write to the mayor and premier to ask them to support this global initiative. And is it your understanding that that is the case for cities around the world? I mean, we all have very different governance models depending on where we are, but is that your understanding as well? Cities won't be able to do everything, but that other levels of government as well, all working together, will form this initiative for this treaty.
Okay, if I've understood properly, the question is, are all of the cities that endorse also asking their higher level governments to negotiate this treaty?
No, sorry, no, I wasn't really clear. Just that it's recognized that different levels of government, whether it's here in Canada or elsewhere in the world, different levels of government will have different places where they're responsible for meeting some of the goals and initiatives of the treaty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it varies wildly depending on the country that you're in. And so, for example, we've been in conversation with some Swedish cities, and there's really strict limitations there on what Swedish cities are able to do or not do. And so we've seen some examples from cities that have endorsed treaty, like LA has moved to ban oil and gas drilling in their jurisdiction. In Amsterdam, they're working to ban fossil fuel advertising in the city. So obviously we have a whole range of kind of toolkit actions for a fossil-free city that cities can decide to take once they've endorsed the treaty, but it really depends on the local context. First, what cities that endorse treaty are committing to is those 3 pillars of stopping expansion of fossil fuels, a fair phase out, and a just energy transition. And then what they do beyond that kind of depends on you know, the authority that they have in their context. But the idea, I know that Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal have all done so, is writing up to the national government, because ultimately it's going to be countries that negotiate a treaty, but we do want to build this collective pressure from below that cities can really generate.
Excellent. Thank you. That was exactly what I thought, and well articulated. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thanks for coming out.
Great. Thank you. I see no further questions. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Our next delegation is Sarah Washburn.
Hi, good afternoon. Again, my name is Sarah Washburn. I'm in the ward of Orleans, and I'm also here to speak on behalf of For Our Kids Ottawa, which is a group of over 600 parents in the community. I'm very new to any kind of activism, or I've never attended a city meeting before, so bear with me if I seem off key. Just speaking for myself, not on behalf of For Our Kids, I'm actually really surprised that the city is still really talking about assessments and plans, and maybe doesn't have necessarily a clear budget for the climate crisis. And the issues of stovepiping is pretty concerning. I would hope that we could very soon get to where we're taking clear actions and have a very clear high priority budget for this very dangerous issue that we face, the climate emergency. So I'm a mother, and that's what really motivates me to be here today. And the city of Ottawa declared a climate emergency over 3 years ago. And just quoting a document here, says, with the intent of deepening its commitment to protecting our community from climate change. So I would say it's wonderful and very hopeful to see this treaty being tabled today here in Ottawa. And I would hope it would be a little bit of a no-brainer that this should be endorsed. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty has been formally endorsed by over 50 communities, including our Canadian neighbors in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. So I just read recently that fossil fuels are the source of 86% of CO2 emissions that cause climate change. Our children are breathing toxic, polluted air from the burning of fossil fuels, and climate disruption from the burning of fossil fuels is causing severe storms and heat waves to hit our community with increasing intensity and greater frequency. I mean, when was the last time anyone here heard of 2 tornado watches in Ottawa in the span of just a few weeks? I mean, things are getting worse. Many of our kids are just too young to fully understand the risks we face in this climate emergency. So as their parents and caregivers, and as their municipal government, we all need to advocate and act on their behalf now to ensure they have a livable and safe future. We have to reduce even further harm caused by fossil fuels. For Our Kids Ottawa Gatineau supports the 3 pillars of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, calling on governments of all levels to urgently commence an end to fossil fuel production expansion, a phasing out of existing production in line with the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees, and a just transition with global support to ensure no worker, no community, or country is left behind. The climate emergency presents severe health and safety hazards. Our children deserve better. The challenges are as significant as they are worthwhile. By endorsing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, Ottawa will send a clear message that it intends to take real climate action and that addressing the climate emergency is a priority. Please endorse this motion today for our children's sake. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm not seeing any questions for you, so appreciate your time here today. And our next delegation is Susie Potts, also with For Our Kids Ottawa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Susie, and I'm speaking also on behalf of For Our Kids Ottawa. So thank you for taking the time to listen today. we're really hopeful that City Council endorses this motion. For parents, it's so exciting to see that there's momentum building at the City Council level for taking steps towards making actual progress towards addressing the causes and mitigating climate change. As 4Kids has mentioned before at these meetings, municipal governments have a very crucial role to play in climate solutions and can have a significant impact on how prepared Ottawa can be as we face climate changes as a city. We are asking the council to support this motion because Ottawa and Canada need a plan on how we will move forward towards renewable energy. The transition is not something that can happen overnight, so a clear direction is important, and those plans need to start now. While some may state that this motion is words and just words, words matter. Words direct action, and we can use this endorsement to help view future decisions by the council. Will the motion bring us closer to decreasing our dependence on fossil fuels, or will it bring us backwards? Words also matter as they provide a signal of hope. Our children need this hope, and their parents do too. Of course, this cannot be the only path forward. Climate change has many solutions that need to be addressed, and the Environment Committee agenda today shows exactly that. But by saying yes to this path, we are saying yes to a future that is greener and more hopeful, one with less air pollution and less water pollution, less asthma, and fewer negative health impacts. A lot of these have been already talked about today, but I would like to highlight some of the huge health hazards of fossil fuel use. These are only some of them, but fossil fuel air pollution is responsible for 8.7 million deaths per year worldwide. That's 1 in 5 deaths globally and 1 in 7 premature deaths here in Canada. 86% of Canadians live in areas where air pollution exceeds the guidelines issued by the World Health Organization. Transportation-related air pollution increases the risk of COVID-19 related illness and death. Gas appliances are the main source of nitrogen dioxide, a highly reactive gas that causes respiratory tract damage and chronic lung disease. Health Canada has found that most Canadian gas stoves exceed their long-term indoor guidelines for nitrogen dioxide exposure. The incidence of Lyme disease from warming temperatures has increased 10 times from 2009 to 2018 and is projected to rise another 6 times by 2050 in Canada. Last year, the 2021 heat dome caused 569 heat-related deaths in British Columbia in a single week. And sadly, Ottawa is seeing more frequent and severe storms as a result of climate change. The big storm that ripped through Ontario and Quebec recently claimed the lives of more than 10 people, several from the Ottawa area. So with all that in mind, on behalf of more than 600 parents in Ottawa that we represent with 4Kids, we would ask if you would endorse this motion. Please prioritize the health and safety of our children and say yes to planning a better future for our kids. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Ms. Potts, any questions for our delegation? Seeing none, thank you for your call today. And finally, our last delegation is Cecile Wilson. Welcome back, Cecile.
Hi, thank you, Chair, and good afternoon this time, and thanks once again for allowing me to speak before you. Before I begin, I would just like to note that Cafes has officially endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, today I'm speaking as a private individual. One of the earlier items in this meeting concerned the recently released Climate Change Vulnerability and Risk Assessment Report. This report rightly addresses the threats to lives and livelihoods that Ottawa faces from the increased likelihood of extreme weather events. However, it would be counterproductive to concentrate on mitigation without addressing the root cause of all these costly threats. And this is why I urge this committee and the City Council to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. The actions of the federal and provincial governments to subsidize the fossil fuel industry are causing economic and social harm to the people of Ottawa. Subsidies to the fossil fuel industry support the production of products that are increasing the global average temperature and further destabilizing the climate. The result is that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more intense. As we experienced last month in Ottawa, intense weather events like the May derecho can have repercussions that are expensive in terms of lives, repairs, and reparations. 10 people died in Ontario, and the cost of the damage was estimated by the Insurance Bureau of Canada to be more than $720 million making it the 6th most damaging storm in Canadian history. And that's just for Ontario. If there is something we can do about diminishing the likelihood of another such storm, shouldn't we do it? Some may argue that we don't have the means to start divesting from fossil fuels, or that it would be too expensive to do so. But can we really afford to pay for storms like this one on a regular basis? Are we willing for such extreme events to become more common? And are we prepared to accept the kind of losses in life and income that they will bring? As the capital city of Canada, I think Ottawa should show leadership in the effort to protect our people, our economy, and our planet. Make no mistake, as destructive weather becomes more and more commonplace, our economy will suffer. Even the head of the International Energy Agency has said that the world cannot have any new fossil fuel projects if we are to meet the goal of keeping the global average temperature increase to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as we've seen earlier in today's meeting, even a rise in temperature that doesn't seem like it would be significant brings a much higher climate hazard risk to our communities. Endorsing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty would bring several benefits. First, it would complement the plans the city is developing for climate risk mitigation. Second, it would ensure that the money spent on risk mitigation would not be wasted by continuing to support fossil fuel infrastructure. And third, it would send a message that Ottawa is serious about the present and future well-being of our inhabitants and our environment. Please support Councillor McKenney's motion to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecile. Not seeing any questions, so appreciate once again your time here today. All right, so thank you. So no further correspondence or delegations. Questions for staff. We heard Andrea sort of speak briefly to this and why they feel it's not a risk at all to endorse such a treaty, and others have done it. But any questions for staff or for Councillor McKenney as the mover? I'm not seeing any. I do need to ask that to vote on this. I do need to ask that I get another count. There we go. I just needed at least 6 for, I think maybe it's 5. Anyway, 6 is better. So let me just bring the thing back open. Great. So the item in front of us, that Standing Committee on Environment Protection, Water and Waste Management recommend Council 1, formally endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and 2, approve that the Mayor on behalf of Council and the City of Ottawa send a letter to the Prime Minister of Canada and the Premier of Ontario urging the Canadian and Ontario governments to support the global initiative for a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yeas and nays, please, Chair.
Sure.
Thank you.
Are you there? Councillor Brockington? Councillor Cloutier?
Yes.
Councillor DeRose? Not there. Councillor Egley?
Yes.
Councillor Hubley? Not present. Councillor King?
Yes.
Councillor McKenney?
Yes.
Vice Chair Menard?
Yes.
And Chair Moffat?
Yep.
That's 6 yeas. Carries.
All right. Thank you. And now we move to item number 7, which is the motion that Councillor Menard brought up previously, asking staff to consult with the public to bring the tree protection bylaw in line, both suburban area and urban area, to be in line with one another. We do have a delegation, 2 delegations on this as well. So I don't know if Councillor Menard, it's pretty straightforward. I don't know if you need to speak to it much more than what I just said.
Good, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. So it's again, so that it's tree protection bylaw to decrease the distinctive tree diameter to 30 centimeters in the suburban area. We've already done this in the urban area. This itself wouldn't do it, but we'd go out and follow the same process that we did when we did the reduction in the urban area. So just following that same process, but applying it to the suburban area, where just because it falls along a different boundary doesn't mean the tree is less significant in that built up setting. So our first speaker on this is once again, Barbara Ramsey.
Thanks again, Chair Moffat. And thank you, Vice Chairman Hart, for bringing this motion as you tie up this, start to move towards the end of this term of council. This is actually one of the first motions that issues that I ever spoke about as a member of cafes. That was before, that was in 2020, before cafes even incorporated. And just so you know, as we grow as an organization, we incorporated almost a year ago now. And this really galvanized my emotions and my presence on this issue. I was already the chair of the Canada Green Space, which is the hat, I'll switch hats now, that I have on right now. And we had already had a chance to meet many of you as our community in Canada North lobbied you folks to get involved, be involved, and help us in this fiasco that Club Link was attempting to create in our communities. So this particular issue I struggled with back then, and I struggled with it not because I worry, I chastise myself frequently. I like to see a lot, so I like a high level of view, and I often eschew getting tied up in the weeds. But the matters around the size and breast height of trees and why we would deem to protect a tree of that characteristic downtown, but it wasn't worthy of that protection in the core, never sat in the suburban areas, never sat well with me. So as I worked in cafes, we have upwards of beyond 50 community associations now, and we're moving on hundreds of members and growing. It's wonderful to see this desire to correct a situation that is obviously worthy of fixing. And I'm just here quickly to tell you today, this is what we need from my real world experience. The KGPC has just finished paying $250,000 for the luxury of joining our city, joining your staff at the OLT in this fight against Club Link. We could get no traction on tree protection. The city tried to support us with forestry, but as you know, unless it's a SAR, and there's only a couple of them that are actually evident in our corner of Ontario, unless you've got a species at risk, and a designated tree. We happen to have a couple of butternuts, but we couldn't save very much woodlot based on a couple of butternuts. And every tool that we can get is a tool that matters, because you know something, Mary Hegan said it well. I happen to love Mary Hegan. Mary Hegan deserves her tree. We all deserve our tree. You should go outside after your meeting today and look at a tree and choose that tree, because each one of them matters. And Vice Chairman Ard, this motion is logical. It doesn't need a huge delegation. It's just the right thing to do. Let's get good policy and good bylaw and enforcement going in Ottawa. That's really what we need. So thank you for this. And thank you again, while I'm here, from the KGPC for all that you've done to help us protect the environment. And I hope you've taken an opportunity since Friday to look at the interesting piece of policy and enforcement coming out of Montreal on the matter of open and green space protection. They happen to be golf courses because we have so little space left, but it's the principle behind it that matters. So thanks. I won't take up more of your time today, but thank you again, Vice Chairman Ard, for bringing this and tying up the loop.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. See any questions? So we move to our next delegation, which is Rochelle LaCour. She is right there, President of the Greater Avalon Community Association.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Chair. And also thank you, Councillor Menard, for bringing up this motion. It's very important to us here in Orleans. I'm speaking on behalf of the Greater Avalon Community Association in Orleans, and also as a member of the cafes, in support of Councillor Menard's motion to decrease the distinctive tree diameter to 30 centimeters in the suburban area. This issue was flagged by the GACA in 2020, but it didn't get anywhere. It wasn't addressed in the tree protection bylaw. So we're happy that the motion is being brought up again, Councillor Menard. Orleans was established in 1830 by a few farming settlers. And in 1958, developers hit the town, and from then on, things haven't been the same. From 81 to 91, the population tripled to 70,000, and developers bought the farmland to create the bedroom community that we have today. The 2021 census determined the population, determined Orleans had a population of over 126. In the next few years, with all the development applications that are coming in, we're going to see an increase easily of another 10 to 15,000 people in Orleans. So you can see that we're going to be growing very exponentially. Orleans has now expanded from the Ottawa River to Navid Road, and on the east, Trim Road, all the way to the Greenbelt. So there's the only development that's left is farmland. Orleans was created on farmland, and because of that, our tree canopy is very slim to none. Knott Woods, for instance, is one of the last standing forested areas in Orleans, and the reason why it's still standing is because it was you couldn't build on it. It's on solid rock. So the citizens of Orleans really petitioned to get this area preserved. A forest or a single tree is like a child. They need care and nurturing to grow big and strong. Like every other child is different, so is a tree. They grow differently and at a different pace depending on where they grow and how they're protected and nurtured. We have a 90-centimeter hackberry tree in front of our house that was planted by the city 22 years ago. However, that tree, you can't compare it to a maple or an oak tree that's more than 22 years old. That could be much taller or bigger. Allowing any tree to be cut down under 30 centimeters is a travesty to the environment, especially when the tree canopy in Orleans is already lower than any other area in Orleans. Because we are a farming community, all the trees were cut down to create fields to plow and sow corn or whatever farmers wanted to grow. So we're very limited for green space, except for areas where builders couldn't build, such as ravines or unstable lands, or areas like I mentioned, the Knott Woods, and it's a 5-hectare forest. That again, thank you to the city for preserving that for us. We're really grateful. Council passed a motion in November 2020 to approving the tree protection bylaw to reduce the diameter of in the inner urban area, and that's what we object with, because you're again segregating the city and by dividing it into inner urban, urban, suburban. When we're looking at trees, 50 centimeter a tree for Orleans it should be the same thing as what you're doing for the city of Ottawa. There shouldn't be a distinction between urban, suburban. A tree's a tree, 30 centimeters is a very small tree in a new community such as Orleans, which is a young community. And we need all the trees that we can to preserve them. So I strongly recommend that you support Councillor Menard's motion today and possibly increase the recommendation to allow the same 30 centimeter to apply also to villages and other areas around Ottawa. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rochelle. Appreciate that today. Now, I noticed in your comments you mentioned about there's really no land left but agricultural land. I will point out that we did come up with a very highly misunderstood proposal called the Gold Belt, which was able to show that the city could actually grow out to the year 2100 and a population of 2 million people without having to encroach on agricultural land or environmentally sensitive lands around the city's perimeter. Obviously not what we'd want to do, but it was just the exercise was to show that within its current policies that you could actually do that without touching agricultural land. Now, council may choose, and sometimes does choose, to build on agricultural land when they don't have to, but they don't have to expand on agricultural land. There are other options available. Do we have any questions for the delegation? I don't see any. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
There was some other correspondence as well from Susan Davies, Friends of Chapel Forest, and John Dickey with the Eastern Ontario Landlord Organization. Just trying to see. YOLO was against it, but I'm not really sure why. It's just, anyway, it's just going out to consult on extending a policy. Okay, so any questions for staff on this or for Councillor Menard who brought forward the motion? Councillor Menard, go ahead.
I'll just make a quick comment before the vote on it. I just wanted to thank two people in particular on this. The first is Councillor McKenney, actually, because Councillor McKenney has worked on this hand in hand and was part of the idea stage to make sure that this came forward as a consultation item. So really huge thanks to Councillor McKenney for that. And the second one, and most important, I think, is Martha Copestake, who has worked to help draft this motion and has been instrumental in the protection of trees in Ottawa and a huge source of information for councillors across the board. So thank you for all your work this term, Martha, and everything you've done on this motion as well. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, we're certainly blessed at this committee. I find like everyone that we work with, whether it's in the solid waste group, Shelley McPherson or not Shelley McPherson, sorry, Shelley McDonald, that's the RVCA staff. I'm getting confused, people. With Nicole and the whole team over there. And then you have forestry with Martha, and then you have Andrea Flowers' group. It's just, we're very blessed with strong teams within all the groups that we work with at this committee. So it certainly helps us move along items and advance the city's agenda on important files like this one. So thank you, Councillor Menard. Thank you, Martha. So the item before us today is that the Standing Committee on Environmental Protection, Water and Waste Management recommend Council direct staff to consult with the public and bring forward a report in Q2 2023 to amend the Tree Protection Bylaw 2023-40 to reduce the size of a distinctive tree in a suburban area of Ottawa from 50 centimeters to 30 centimeters in diameter measured at breast height. Is that item carried?
Carried.
Carried. Thank you. There are no in-camera items. We have the information previously distributed on the use of delegated authority by the Public Works Department. Notices of motion, unaware of any inquiries, also unaware of any other business. There's never any other business. Adjournments. Done. As mentioned earlier in the meeting, I teased it. The next meeting is Tuesday, September 20th, 2022. I'll see you in September. That's not. I don't think I'm allowed to. I don't own the rights to that song, so I'm gonna get in trouble on YouTube because that was just played on YouTube. So I've been in trouble for that before. I don't want to get in trouble again. Okay, we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a summer.